The vast Mongolian steppe stretches endlessly, a sea of grass rolling beneath a sky that seems larger than anywhere else on Earth. In the 12th century, when Temüjin, the boy who would one day become known as Genghis Khan, first opened his eyes to the world, this was the landscape that shaped his life. Imagine a place where trees are scarce, where the wind never truly rests, and where the horizon is a flat and distant line. The land seems both empty and full at the same time. Empty because the human settlements are sparse, scattered like small islands across a vast green ocean. Full because every direction holds subtle changes of color, of sound, and of movement, waves of grass bending to the endless wind, the distant shapes of horses grazing, or the fleeting shadow of an eagle passing above. The climate is harsh. Winters are long and bitter, with temperatures that can fall far below freezing. Snow covers the ground, turning the land into a white expanse where survival is a test of endurance. In summer, the same land transforms into dry plains, the sun relentless, baking the earth and pulling the water away. The extremes of cold and heat make the steppe both unforgiving and instructive. It is a land that teaches its people resilience. To live here is to understand that nothing comes easily, and that nature itself is a constant adversary. As much as it is a provider, water sources are scattered rivers winding like silver threads through the grass, small lakes shimmering under the sun. These are lifelines for the nomadic families who depend on them for their herds. Horses, sheep, goats, camels, and cattle are all vital, and without water, none of them could survive. Around the rivers and lakes, the camps of yurts appear, their white felt walls contrasting against the green of the steppe. Beyond those oases, the land stretches on, silent except for the wind. The wind is one of the defining features of the steppe. It blows almost constantly, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, carrying dust across the plains or sharpening the cold of winter. At night, it whistles through the grass, reminding every traveler of the vast emptiness around them. Under the stars, the steppe is darker than almost anywhere else. Yet the sky is more alive, stars so numerous and so sharp that they seem within reach. For the nomads, this sky is not only a roof but also a map, guiding them across the endless land. For a child like Temüjin, this environment was both home and challenge. His earliest years were lived in a world without the protections that we might take for granted. The cold could kill, hunger could strike without warning, and isolation was constant. Yet, in the rhythm of the steppe, there was also a kind of peace. The sound of horse hooves, the crackle of fire inside a yurt, the soft tones of family voices all became part of the background music of life. The seasons brought a cycle of hardship and renewal. In spring, the grass returned, feeding the animals and offering hope. In summer, herds grew strong, milk and meat became plentiful, and families could travel further. Autumn was a time of preparation, storing what was needed for the coming cold. Winter then arrived with silence and scarcity, a time when only the strong survived. This endless cycle shaped the Mongols into a people hardened by necessity and closely tied to the land. The beauty of the steppe is subtle, not the dramatic beauty of mountains or forests, but the quiet majesty of space. The endless horizon can make a person feel small, yet also free. The steppe has no walls, no boundaries, only the slow and steady passage of time. For those who grew up here, like Temüjin, this land was not just a backdrop, but a teacher. It taught patience, endurance, and the importance of moving with the rhythms of nature rather than fighting against them. When we imagine Genghis Khan later commanding armies that crossed continents, it is worth remembering that it all began here, in this world of grass and sky. The steppe gave him his first lessons. That survival requires strength, that life is fragile, and that in vast emptiness one must learn to create meaning and purpose. In the silence of the plains, broken only by the sound of wind, the foundations of an empire were quietly being laid in the heart of a boy who would one day change the world. Life on the Mongolian steppe during the 12th century was not centered on stone houses or permanent towns. Instead, it revolved around movement, impermanence, and adaptation. The Mongols were nomads, and their way of life was deeply tied to the animals they raised and the landscapes they crossed. To live here meant to live lightly, carrying only what could move with you, and to see home not as a fixed place, but as wherever your people chose to settle their camp. The center of nomadic life was the ger, more commonly called the yurt. This circular tent, made of wooden frames and covered in felt, was both sturdy and portable. It could be taken down in less than an hour, loaded onto carts or the backs of animals, and rebuilt at the next site with equal speed. Inside, the yurt was simple but functional. Beds along the sides, a fire in the middle, and small spaces for cooking, storing food, and keeping tools. Smoke from the fire drifted upward and escaped through an opening at the top, which also let in light during the day. For the nomads, the yurt was more than a shelter. It was a symbol of their flexibility, their resilience, and their deep connection to mobility. At the heart of nomadic life were the herds. Horses were the most prized animals. They were not only used for travel and war, but also for milk, meat, and hides. A Mongol could ride several horses in a single day, switching from one to another so that none became exhausted. Sheep and goats provided wool and dairy products, while cattle and camels carried loads during migrations. The animals provided nearly everything a family needed, and their health determined the survival of the people. When the animals thrived, so did the families. When disease struck the herds, hunger was never far behind. Daily routines followed the needs of the animals. At dawn, herders led the flocks to pasture. Children often joined this task, learning from a young age how to guide the animals across the open plains. Women managed much of the household work, tending fires, preparing food, making clothes, and maintaining the yurts while men hunted, herded, or prepared for conflict. Life was balanced between necessity and tradition, every task reinforcing the bond between family, animals, and land. Food was simple, hearty, and directly tied to the herds. Dairy products were central. Fermented mare's milk, called airag, was a common drink, slightly sour and mildly alcoholic. Cheese, curd, and dried yogurt provided nourishment during travels. Meat was eaten when available, often boiled, roasted, or dried into strips that could last through the winter. Vegetables were scarce, and grains were limited, making life heavily dependent on livestock. Yet, despite the simplicity, these meals gave strength to endure the harsh environment. Nomadic families did not think of wealth in terms of coins or property. Wealth was measured in the number and health of animals. Horses, in particular, were treasured, and the loss of even a few could bring hardship. This system made the nomads independent of markets and cities. They lived according to the rhythm of the steppe, answering only to the needs of their herds and the seasons. Migration was a regular part of life. When pastures became exhausted or water grew scarce, families would pack their yurts, load carts with possessions, and move on. The sight of a caravan crossing the plains was common. Lines of animals carrying loads, children riding ponies, adults guiding the path. These migrations were not random. Families returned to familiar campsites each year, following routes that had served their ancestors for generations. Community was essential for survival. Extended families formed clans, and clans often traveled together. Cooperation made tasks easier and provided security against raids from rivals. At night, when camps settled, songs and stories were shared, keeping alive the history of the people and the values that bound them together. For young Temüjin, growing up in this environment meant learning to ride a horse before he could walk steadily, learning to draw a bow before mastering words, and understanding from the beginning that life was fragile, dependent on animals, weather, and the loyalty of kin. The constant movement taught him that nothing was permanent, and that survival required adaptability. The life of the nomad was harsh, but it was also freeing. With no walls to confine them, the Mongols lived under the open sky, surrounded by a horizon that had no end. To them, the steppe was not empty, but alive. Every gust of wind, every star, every hoofbeat was part of the rhythm of existence. This rhythm shaped a people who were tough, resourceful, and always prepared to move forward. Out of this life of constant motion would rise the man who would one day command the largest empire the world had ever seen. In the 12th century, a child was born on the windswept steppe. His name was Temüjin. To history, he would become known as Genghis Khan. But before he commanded armies, before he became a conqueror, he was only a boy. Growing up in the unforgiving world of the Mongolian plains, his childhood was not one of comfort. He was born into the clan of his father, Yasuge, a respected leader, though not the most powerful. The family lived as other nomads did, moving from pasture to pasture, living in yurts, dependent on their animals and the land. Temüjin's earliest memories were shaped by this life. The smell of wood smoke in the yurt, the sound of horses outside, the endless sweep of grassland stretching toward the horizon. At a young age, Temüjin learned to ride. In the steppe, a child was expected to sit on a horse almost as soon as he could stand. Riding was not a skill to be learned later. It was the foundation of life. Temüjin, like every Mongol child, grew up with horses as constant companions. They were toys, transportation, and lifelines. By the time he was only a few years old, he could guide a pony across the plains with ease. The bond with animals went beyond riding. Temüjin learned to care for them, to notice when a horse was weak or when a sheep needed attention. He learned to depend on them for food, drinking their milk, eating their meat, and using their hides for warmth. For a boy of the steppe, animals were more than possessions. They were survival itself. Yet childhood on the steppe was never simple. Life was always close to danger. Hunger was common. Winters could be brutal, with snow and ice making it difficult to keep herds alive. Disease might strike the animals or the people. Raiders from rival clans could appear without warning, taking livestock, burning camps, and leaving only hardship behind. From his earliest days, Temüjin grew up in a world where security was fragile and trust was uncertain. One of the defining moments of his childhood came when his father, Yasuge, was poisoned by enemies. Temüjin was still young when it happened, and the death of his father left the family vulnerable. Without the protection of a powerful leader, they were abandoned by their clan and left to survive alone. For a mother and her children on the steppe, this was nearly a death sentence. But Temüjin's mother, Aikilan, was determined. She gathered her children and taught them to endure. They survived by foraging, by fishing in rivers, by gathering roots and berries. It was a harsh education for a boy, but it planted in him a sense of resilience that would never leave. As a child, Temüjin also learned the ways of loyalty and betrayal. In the steppe, alliances were fragile. Families could be close one season and enemies the next. Trust was rare, and betrayal was common. Temüjin experienced this instability firsthand. watching how quickly relationships could shift. These lessons would stay with him, shaping his later insistence on loyalty earned by merit, not by birth. Despite the hardship, childhood was not without moments of warmth. Around the fire in the yurt, stories were told. Elders spoke of ancestors, of spirits, of the eternal blue sky that watched over the steppe. Songs filled the air at night, songs about horses, about battles, about love. Even in the harshest environment, culture and memory gave people strength. For young Temüjin, these stories became part of him, connecting him to generations before and giving him a sense of destiny. Temüjin's early life was marked by contrasts: freedom and danger, family love and clan betrayal, abundance in summer and hunger in winter. Each experience taught him something. From the vast horizon, he learned to think in terms of space and distance. From hardship, he learned to endure. From betrayal, he learned caution. From his mother, he learned determination. By the time he was still a boy, Temüjin had lived through events that would have broken many others. But for him, they became lessons. The child of the steppe grew strong in the face of adversity. The boy who tended horses, who foraged for food, who listened to stories by the fire, would carry these memories into adulthood. They would shape the leader he would become, and through him, the fate of millions. The steppe gave him little comfort, but it gave him strength. It gave him hunger, but it also gave him determination. And in the quiet spaces of his childhood, when the wind swept across the plains and the stars filled the sky, it gave him a sense of belonging to something larger, world vast and eternal, waiting for those bold enough to shape it. Life on the steppe in the 12th century was not governed by cities, nor by written laws, nor by the kind of centralized authority that most parts of the world already knew. Instead, society was built on tribes and clans, small groups bound together by blood, loyalty, and necessity. For the Mongols, and for the young Temüjin who grew up among them, this was the structure that defined every relationship, every alliance, and every conflict. A tribe was not simply a collection of families. It was a network of kinship, shaped by ancestry and reinforced by custom. Each tribe had a leader, often called a Khan. The Khan's authority rested on his ability to protect his people, to lead them in raids, and to secure resources. Leadership was not entirely hereditary. A son might inherit his father's position, but only if he proved capable. Strength, cunning, and generosity were all expected of a leader. If a Khan failed to provide, his people could abandon him, turning their loyalty elsewhere. Clans were the smaller units within tribes. A clan might consist of a few extended families, moving and living together. Within the clan, cooperation was essential. Families shared the work of herding, of defending the camp, and of raising children. Marriage was often a tool for strengthening ties between clans. A union between two families could create peace, or at least delay conflict. But just as easily, broken promises or rival claims could spark feuds that lasted for generations. The structure of tribal life was fluid. Unlike kingdoms with borders carved into maps, the tribes of the steppe shifted constantly. One season might see alliances formed, sealed with marriage or shared victories. Another season might see those same groups at war with each other. Loyalties were often temporary, based on immediate need rather than lasting bonds. Trust was fragile, and betrayal was never far away. This instability meant that strength was always tested. A tribe that grew weak might be absorbed by a stronger one. A Khan who lost battles might find his followers drifting to a rival. For children like Temüjin, growing up in this environment meant learning early that survival depended not just on family, but on navigating a complex web of relationships. The tribes were not all the same. Some were larger, more powerful, able to field many warriors. Others were smaller, barely more than a few families. Yet all shared the same essential way of life: herding animals, moving with the seasons, and defending themselves from both nature and enemies. Honor was important, but practicality often outweighed it. A man might swear loyalty, but if his Khan failed to protect him, he would not hesitate to change allegiance. Even religion played a role in the tribal structure. The Mongols believed in the eternal blue sky, a force that stretched over all the land. Shamans acted as mediators, interpreting signs, offering rituals, and guiding spiritual life. But even this spiritual authority was tied to the needs of the tribe. Shamans could strengthen the legitimacy of a Khan, or weaken him if they declared that the spirits no longer favored his rule. The organization of the tribes created a world of constant tension. Cooperation was necessary, yet conflict was always close. No tribe could live entirely alone, for trade and marriage were essential. But no tribe could ever be entirely safe, for alliances might collapse at any moment. This was the world into which Temüjin was born, a world where loyalty was fragile, where leadership was always contested, and where the bonds of family could mean both security and danger. For Temüjin, these lessons were learned not in books, but in daily life. He saw how alliances were made and broken. He saw how leaders could rise or fall in the eyes of their people. He saw how fragile the structure of society was, and how easily it could be reshaped by force, by persuasion, or by betrayal. These experiences did not just shape his childhood, they shaped his vision of leadership, teaching him that power must rest on more than bloodlines, that it must be earned, enforced, and renewed constantly. The tribal world of the Mongols was unstable, fragile, and often violent. Yet it was also dynamic, flexible, and adaptable. In its constant shifting, it created opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. For the young Temüjin, watching and learning in this world of clans and khans, it was both a lesson in survival and the first step on a path that would eventually change the course of history. The steppe was a place of wide horizons, but beneath that open sky, trust was narrow and fragile. Alliances between tribes were made out of necessity, not out of deep loyalty. Every family, every clan, every Khan understood that survival depended on others. Yet they also knew that betrayal was always close. In this environment, rivalry and treachery were as much a part of life as the rising of the sun or the blowing of the wind. When two tribes came together, it was often sealed with gifts or with marriage. A daughter might be given in marriage to the son of another Khan. A feast might be held, with horses and goods exchanged. Promises were spoken, oaths were made, and for a time peace might follow. But these bonds were never permanent. A poor harvest, the loss of livestock, or the death of a leader could unravel everything. The same families who shared meals one season might raid each other the next. Temüjin saw this pattern from an early age. His own family had once been secure under his father, Yasuge. But when Yasuge died, poisoned by rivals, that fragile protection collapsed. The allies who had once respected him abandoned his widow and her children. In a world where power mattered above all else, loyalty without strength meant nothing. Left alone, Temüjin's family experienced firsthand the cruelty of betrayal. Friends became strangers, and those who had once promised support vanished into the endless grasslands. Rivalries between tribes were constant. Some were old, stretching back generations, remembered in stories and curses. Others were new, sparked by raids, theft, or insults. These rivalries often erupted into violence. Warriors on horseback would appear suddenly at dawn, circling herds, shouting, driving animals away, leaving destruction in their path. Retaliation would follow, sometimes immediately, sometimes years later. The cycle was endless, a rhythm of raid and revenge, peace and hostility. For young boys growing up on the steppe, this instability was their education. They learned early that trust was not to be given lightly. They saw how leaders used generosity to keep allies, and how greed or arrogance could turn followers into enemies. They understood that survival depended not only on courage, but on caution. Even when sitting at a feast, with laughter and shared wine, there was always the possibility that tomorrow those same companions could become foes. Temüjin's own youth was marked by such betrayals. After his father's death, his family was left to fend for themselves. They lived in poverty, surviving on roots, berries, and fishing. Other clans that might have offered protection did not. To them, a leaderless family was not worth the risk. The lesson was clear. Alliances were fragile. Respect had to be earned, and weakness could not be forgiven. These betrayals also shaped how Temüjin came to understand leadership. He would later build his own power, not on promises of birthright, but on loyalty proven through action. He would demand loyalty, but he would also reward it generously. He learned that men would betray weak leaders, but they would stay with those who provided security, justice, and opportunity. The rivalries of his youth taught him the value of trust and the dangers of failing to secure it. Even within families, rivalries could turn bitter. Brothers might compete for authority. Cousins might fight for inheritance. The bonds of blood were strong, but they were not unbreakable. For Temüjin, whose family struggled after his father's death, rivalry even existed within his own kin. His brothers, each trying to assert themselves, created tension and conflict. In this way, the harshness of the steppe did not stop at the border of the camp. It reached into the heart of families themselves. The constant threat of treachery gave life on the steppe a restless quality. Camps might seem peaceful, fires glowing, horses grazing nearby, families gathered together. But underneath that calm, there was always uncertainty. Trust could never be assumed. Safety could never be permanent. To live in such a world was to live with vigilance, always aware that betrayal might come when it was least expected. For Temüjin, betrayal was not just an experience, it was a teacher. It showed him the fragility of alliances, the danger of relying on others without power, and the need to create bonds stronger than tradition alone. Out of betrayal, he learned loyalty. Out of rivalry, he learned unity. These early lessons, drawn from hardship and disappointment, would later shape the way he built an empire. After the death of his father, after the abandonment by allies, after the hunger and the years of hardship, Temüjin began slowly to rise. He was still young, but already he had learned the lessons of betrayal, of loyalty, and of the fragile nature of alliances. In the wide emptiness of the steppe, surrounded by enemies, he began to imagine a different kind of strength. Step by step, he started to gather followers. At first, his circle was small. His family remained close, his mother, Achilon, guiding and encouraging him, his brothers and sisters growing alongside him. But beyond family, Temüjin needed allies, people who would stand with him, not because of blood, but because of choice. This was rare on the steppe. Most men gave loyalty to their clan alone. Temüjin wanted something different. He believed that loyalty should be earned, not inherited, and that it should be rewarded, not taken for granted. One of the first to join him was Bawarku, a young man from another clan. Their meeting became part of Temüjin's legend. When Temüjin's horses were stolen, Bawoku helped him recover them, showing courage and loyalty. Temüjin recognized his value and welcomed him as a brother in arms. From that moment, Bawoku became one of his closest companions, a sign that true loyalty could come from outside bloodlines. Another was Delmi, who also showed devotion in ways that Temüjin never forgot. Later in life, Delmi would save him by sucking poison from a wound, nearly giving his own life to preserve his leaders. These early friendships, forged in hardship, created bonds that would prove stronger than those of clan or tribe. For Temüjin, such men were more than allies. They were the foundation of a new kind of following. Temüjin began to gather others in the same way. He sought men who were brave, who were skilled, but most importantly, who were loyal. He promised them protection, fairness, and opportunity. He treated them not as servants, but as brothers. In return, they gave him their trust. Slowly, the circle grew. These first companions would later become known as his Anda, sworn brothers who pledged their lives to him and to each other. The process of gathering followers was not dramatic. It did not happen in one battle or in one moment. It was quiet, gradual, built on small acts of trust and courage. Around the campfires of the steppe, men spoke of Temüjin as someone different, a leader who valued merit more than birth, who rewarded those who served him, and who did not forget loyalty. In a world where betrayal was common, this reputation mattered. Temüjin also understood the importance of marriage alliances. He had been betrothed from a young age to Bert, a woman from another clan. Their marriage was not only personal but political. By joining with Bert, Temüjin gained new allies and strengthened his position. The bond between them would endure through hardship, and Bert herself would later play a vital role in his rise. As his circle of followers grew, Temüjin began to take on the responsibilities of leadership. He defended his people, organized hunts, and prepared for conflicts. He demanded discipline, but he also gave rewards. Horses, livestock, and spoils from raids were shared fairly, strengthening the loyalty of his companions. This was different from many Khans who kept wealth for themselves and their families. Temüjin's fairness set him apart. But his path was not easy. Rivals watched his rise with suspicion. Some tried to crush him before he grew too strong. Temüjin faced capture, imprisonment, and humiliation at the hands of enemies. Yet he survived, and each survival added to his reputation. Those who followed him saw in him not only courage, but resilience. He could be beaten, but he could not be broken. For the young men who gathered around Temüjin, the choice to follow him was not just about survival. It was about belief. They saw in him a vision of something greater than clan or tribe. A future where loyalty and strength could create unity in a land divided by rivalry. Slowly, quietly, Temüjin, the boy, became Temüjin, the leader. His followers were few, but they were devoted. Together, they formed the seed of what would one day become an empire. In the silence of the steppe, around the fires at night, in the rhythm of hooves on the plains, a new force was beginning to grow. It was still fragile, still small, but it was different. It was built not only on blood, but on choice, not only on tradition, but on trust. In those early days, as a young man surrounded by a handful of loyal companions, Temüjin began the long journey that would make him Genghis Khan. On the steppe, for generations, loyalty had followed bloodlines. Men gave allegiance to their fathers, their uncles, and their khans because of birth, not because of choice. But Temüjin, growing into leadership, began to see that this old way created weakness. A man might be loyal to his family, yet careless, greedy, or incapable. A Khan might hold power by tradition, yet fail to protect his people. The old system allowed men to inherit authority without earning it. Temüjin believed there was another way. From his earliest struggles, he had learned that survival depended not only on family, but also on trust, discipline, and ability. When his father died and his clan abandoned him, it was not blood relatives who saved him. It was his mother's determination, and later, the loyalty of men, like Bo, Orku, and Gelmen, who had no obligation to him except the choice they made to follow. These experiences shaped Temüjin's idea of leadership. He would value loyalty, but he would tie it not to ancestry, but to merit. For Temüjin, merit meant ability proven in action. A man's worth was measured by his courage in battle, his honesty in service, and his dedication to the group. Those who showed skill and loyalty rose, regardless of family name. Those who betrayed trust, even if they were relatives, were punished or cast aside. In this way, Temüjin began to build a different kind of following, one stronger than the fragile alliances of clan and tribe. This approach was unusual, even radical, in his time. On the steppe, leadership was expected to flow through kinship. By breaking that pattern, Temüjin challenged the very structure of society. Yet it worked. Men who had long been overlooked by their clans found in him an opportunity. Warriors without powerful family connections could prove themselves and earn rewards. For the first time, ability mattered more than ancestry. The way he treated his companions reinforced this principle. He shared rewards fairly. Spoils of raids were divided not only among family members, but among all who had fought. Horses, livestock, and goods were distributed so that no man felt cheated. In doing this, Temüjin created trust. His followers knew that service would bring them honor and wealth, not just empty promises. This fairness contrasted sharply with many other leaders, who kept riches for themselves and their closest kin. Discipline was another cornerstone of his rule. Temüjin demanded order, even in small matters. His followers were expected to remain loyal, to obey commands, and to act with unity. Disobedience or betrayal was not tolerated. This strictness might have seemed harsh, but it created stability. Men knew what was expected, and they knew that justice would be enforced. On the steppe, where betrayal was common, this reliability was refreshing. Stories of his leadership began to spread. People spoke of a young man who rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal without favoritism. They spoke of a leader who listened to advice, who shared burdens, and who remembered those who helped him. These stories attracted more followers. Slowly, men from different clans, tired of fragile alliances and unfair leaders, began to join him. By choosing merit over birth, Temüjin also reduced the divisions that kept tribes apart. A warrior from one clan could fight alongside a warrior from another, not as rivals, but as brothers under the same leader. This breaking of old barriers created a new kind of unity. It was fragile at first, but it carried within it the seed of something larger than tribe, larger than clan. In his youth, Temüjin could not yet have imagined the vast empire he would one day command. But the principle that guided him, loyalty by merit, was already clear. He saw how it created strength where before there had been weakness. He saw how it gave men purpose, how it bound them together more firmly than blood alone ever could. As the seasons passed, and as his circle of companions grew, this principle became the foundation of his leadership. It was simple, yet powerful. Loyalty rewarded, betrayal punished, ability recognized. From this, Temüjin began to shape not only his own destiny, but the destiny of the steppe. In the endless horizon of the Mongolian plains, beneath the eternal blue sky, a new idea was taking root. Loyalty was no longer inherited. it was earned. And in this quiet revolution of thought, the future of the Mongols began to change. As Temüjin grew into his role as a young leader, he and his companions could not survive on loyalty and ideals alone. On the steppe, power was tested in battle. Livestock could be stolen, camps could be raided, and rival clans were always ready to strike. To prove himself, Temüjin had to fight. These first battles were not great campaigns across continents. They were small, sharp struggles fought over herds, over honor, and over survival. Yet in these early encounters, the foundation of his future victories was already visible. The warriors who followed him were few at first. They rode small, sturdy Mongol horses, each man often leading several, so that they could switch mounts and never exhaust a single animal. Their weapons were simple but effective. The composite bow, strong enough to send arrows across long distances. Lances for charging, sabers for close combat. Armor was scarce, often just hardened leather, sometimes reinforced with iron plates. Protection was light, but speed was everything. On the wide plains, mobility mattered more than heavy shields. Temüjin's first clashes were with neighboring clans. Rivalries on the steppe were constant, and Temüjin's growing reputation drew both followers and enemies. Some feared that his rise would upset the delicate balance of power. Others saw him as an opportunity to test their own strength. Raids against his herds, attempts to scatter his camp, and sudden attacks became part of his early life as a leader. In these battles, Temüjin showed the qualities that would later define his campaigns. He was cautious, never rushing blindly into danger. He studied his enemies, waiting for the right moment to strike. When he attacked, he relied on speed, coordination, and discipline. Even with small numbers, his men moved as one, striking quickly and withdrawing before the enemy could recover. These were not grand victories, but they were lessons in command, in trust, and in survival. One of the greatest challenges of these early years was holding his companions together. Defeat could scatter a group as quickly as betrayal. Temüjin understood this, and so after each battle, whether won or lost, he rewarded his men fairly. If spoils were taken, they were shared. If a warrior fought bravely, he was recognized. This fairness created loyalty, and loyalty kept his circle from dissolving when times grew hard. The first victories gave him more than just resources. They gave him reputation. Word spread across the steppe of a young leader who fought with discipline, who rewarded his men, and who survived against stronger enemies. Reputation was power. It drew more warriors to his side, men who were tired of weak cons and who wanted to serve someone who treated them with fairness. But Temüjin also knew defeat. At times, his small band was overwhelmed. At times, they were forced to flee, scattering across the plains to regroup later. Temüjin himself was once captured by a rival clan. Bound and humiliated, he seemed destined for death. But he escaped, aided by a sympathetic guard. This escape, remembered by his companions, became part of his legend. It showed them that even in the darkest moment, Temüjin's will to survive could not be broken. Each battle, each raid, each narrow escape was a test. The men who remained with him through these hardships became more than followers. They became brothers, bound not just by oath, but by shared struggle. In the quiet after battles, around the fires at night, they remembered their victories and their escapes. They learned to trust one another, to rely on each other's courage. This trust was the seed of something greater. The first battles of Temüjin's life were small, almost invisible in the grand scope of history. They did not change the world. They did not conquer kingdoms, but they changed him. They taught him patience, discipline, and the value of loyalty. They taught his men to fight, not as scattered riders, but as a single force. and they showed the steppe that Temüjin was more than just another son of a forgotten Khan. He was a leader who could not be ignored. On the endless grasslands, where the wind carried the sound of hooves and the cries of battle faded quickly into silence, a young leader was learning the art of war. These early struggles, fought not for glory but for survival, were the first steps on a path that would one day stretch across continents. For now, they were only small battles. But for Temüjin and his companions, they were everything. In the steppe, titles were more than names. They were symbols of power, of recognition, of destiny. For years, Temüjin had struggled as an outcast, abandoned after the death of his father, surviving betrayal, gathering loyal companions, and proving himself in battle. Slowly, steadily, his reputation grew. More clans began to notice him, more warriors chose to follow him, and eventually, the time came when Temüjin was no longer just a young leader of a small band. He was chosen as something greater. The title was Genghis Khan. In Mongolian, Khan meant ruler, leader, or lord. It was the word used for the chiefs of tribes and the commanders of men. But Genghis carried a broader meaning, vast, universal, all-encompassing. To be called Genghis Khan was not to lead only a clan. It was to be recognized as a ruler over many, a leader whose authority stretched beyond bloodlines and borders. The gathering where this title was given was called a Khwarezmian, a great council of leaders and warriors. The Khwarezmian was a tradition of the steppe where decisions of importance were made collectively. When Temüjin was raised to the title of Genghis Khan, it was more than a ceremony. It was a recognition of years of struggle and survival. Clans that had once ignored him now acknowledged his strength. Warriors who had fought beside him stood proudly, seeing their loyalty rewarded. The moment was simple. There were no golden crowns, nor marble palaces written decrees. There was only the open steppe, the eternal blue sky above, and the voices of men agreeing that Temüjin was their Khan. The symbolism, however, was powerful. From that day, he was no longer merely Temüjin. He was Genghis Khan, a leader whose authority came not from birthright alone, but from the loyalty of his followers and the respect of those who had seen his strength. The name marked a turning point. It transformed him from a survivor into a ruler. This moment was not the end of struggle, it was only the beginning. Rival clans still remained, powerful enemies still watched, and the steppe was still a place of constant shifting alliances. But the title gave Temüjin something he had not possessed before: legitimacy. It gave him a voice greater than his own, a position recognized by many. It gave him the right to demand loyalty not only from his own companions, but from others across the plains. The men who followed him celebrated this transformation. They knew the hardships they had endured together. They remembered the nights of hunger, the battles where they had been outnumbered, the moments when survival seemed impossible. To see their leader become Genghis Khan was also to see their own loyalty rewarded. They were no longer a band of outcasts. They were the companions of a Khan. For Temüjin, the title was both an honor and a burden. It meant he was no longer free to think only of his own family or his small circle of followers. Now he carried the weight of tribes, the responsibility of leading not just men, but a people. The eternal blue sky seemed to stretch wider than before, as if reminding him that his destiny would not be limited to the plains he had known. The Khwarezmian ended, the men returned to their camps, and the daily life of the steppe continued. A new leader had been named, a leader who was different from the rest. Genghis Khan had risen, and though his empire was not yet born, the first stone had been laid. In the silence of the plains, beneath the endless sky, the boy who had once been abandoned was now recognized as a ruler. The journey was far from over, but the name of Genghis Khan would never again be forgotten. When Temüjin became Genghis Khan, he faced a challenge greater than raids and rival clans. To unite the steppe, and eventually to extend power beyond it, he needed an army unlike any other. On the steppe, every man knew how to ride, how to shoot, and how to fight. But chaos and disunity had always weakened the tribes. Warriors followed their own khans, fought with their own clans, and often broke apart as quickly as they gathered. Genghis Khan wanted something different. He wanted an army built not on tradition, but on discipline, structure, and loyalty. The first step was organization. Genghis Khan divided his army into units based on numbers, not families. At the smallest level was the Arban, a unit of 10 men. These 10 shared responsibilities. They camped together, they fought together, and they were held accountable for one another. If one man failed, the others shared the blame. In this way, loyalty extended beyond family, it extended to comrades. 10 Arbons made a Zuin, or a unit of 100. 10 Zuins made a Mingan, or a unit of 1,000. 10 Mingans made a Tumen, a unit of 10,000. This decimal system allowed the army to expand or contract while maintaining order. It was simple, but it was revolutionary. No matter how large the force became, it could be controlled and directed. Orders could move quickly from the top to the smallest group. Leadership within this structure was not given by birthright. Genghis Khan chose commanders based on merit, on loyalty, and on ability. A man who proved himself in battle could rise, even if he came from humble origins. A man of noble birth who betrayed trust could be cast aside. This broke with the traditions of the steppe, where family lines often decided rank. But it created an army where every man knew that his service might bring reward, and every commander knew that his position depended on loyalty and skill. Discipline was strict, rules were clear, and punishments were severe. Looting without permission was forbidden. Disobeying orders was punished harshly. Desertion was unthinkable. Yet fairness balanced this severity. Just as punishment was certain, so too was reward. Spoils of war were divided in a way that reflected contribution. No man was forgotten, whether he was a common soldier or a commander. In this balance of discipline and fairness, trust was created. Communication was also vital. The Mongol army relied on messengers who could ride swiftly across long distances, carrying orders and reports. Flags, drums, and horns were used during battle to coordinate movements. The steppe had always favored mobility, and Genghis Khan turned this into a system. His warriors could move quickly, striking in one place and disappearing before the enemy could respond. Coordination allowed them to fight not as scattered riders, but as a single body. The mobility of the Mongol army was unmatched. Each warrior kept multiple horses, switching mounts often, so that the animals never tired. They could ride for days, covering distances that surprised and overwhelmed their enemies. They carried dried meat and milk, simple food that lasted long journeys. They could live off the land, drinking mare's milk, eating what they hunted, and surviving without long supply lines. This independence gave them speed and reach far beyond other armies of their time. The strength of this organization was not just military, it was psychological. Soldiers knew they were part of something greater than themselves. They knew that their comrades depended on them, and that their Khan rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal equally. This created a unity that rival tribes and kingdoms could not match. When other forces scattered under pressure, the Mongol army held firm, each man confident in his place, each commander trusted by his men. The steppe had long produced warriors, but under Genghis Khan, these warriors were forged into an army that could move as one, fight as one, and endure as one. The decimal system, the merit-based leadership, the strict discipline, the speed and mobility, all these combined to create a force the world had not seen before. In the endless grasslands, where once tribes had fought in chaos, a new order was taking shape. An order of tens, hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands. An army united not by blood, but by loyalty and by structure. It was quiet at first, almost unnoticed by distant kingdoms. But soon, this organization would allow Genghis Khan to send his warriors far beyond the horizon of the steppe, to conquer lands and cities that had once seemed untouchable. The Mongol army was more than a collection of riders. It was a force shaped by rules, by discipline, and by strategy. On the open steppe, where speed and cunning often mattered more than sheer numbers, Genghis Khan understood that success depended on more than bravery. It required order, planning, and a strict sense of responsibility. Discipline began at the smallest unit. The Arbon, the group of 10 men, was both a military formation and a bond of trust. Each man was responsible for the others. If one failed in his duty, the others shared the punishment. If one deserted, the others were held accountable. This made every soldier not just concerned with his own actions, but also with those of his comrades. It created a shared sense of responsibility, a fabric of trust woven across the entire army. Orders flowed clearly. From the Khan commands, moved through the Tumen, to the Mingen, to the Zuin, and finally to the Arbon. In this way, instructions reached even the smallest groups without confusion. Drums, horns, and banners carried signals during battle, telling soldiers when to advance, when to retreat, when to regroup. In a time when many armies collapsed in the chaos of combat, the Mongols moved with precision. Strategy relied on patience and deception. The Mongols did not always fight directly. Often, they used feigned retreats. A group of warriors might attack suddenly, then turn and flee, drawing the enemy into pursuit. Believing victory was close, the enemy would chase, stretching their lines, losing order. Then, hidden riders would emerge, encircling them, cutting them down with arrows from all sides. This strategy, simple yet devastating, became one of the trademarks of Mongol warfare. Surprise was another weapon. The Mongols moved quickly, often traveling at night, appearing where they were least expected. Entire armies might march for days without rest, covering distances other forces thought impossible. Enemies prepared for a slow approach found themselves overwhelmed before they could react. Villages, cities, even kingdoms fell because the Mongols arrived sooner than anyone believed they could. Discipline also extended to supplies. The Mongols learned to live from what they carried and what they found along the way. Each man kept dried meat, curds, and milk for long journeys. Horses provided not only transport, but also nourishment. A rider could survive by drinking mare's milk, or even by making small cuts in a horse's vein. Taking a few drops of blood to mix with milk, these practices, strange to outsiders, gave the Mongols endurance unmatched by other armies. Punishment for disobedience was severe, but it was balanced with fairness. Loot was divided equally, according to service. A soldier who fought bravely was rewarded, no matter his birth. A commander who disobeyed or betrayed trust could be executed, even if he was of noble lineage. This impartiality created respect. Every man knew that rules applied to all. Every man knew that loyalty was valued above all else. The strategies extended beyond the battlefield. Genghis Khan used intelligence and reconnaissance carefully. Scouts moved far ahead of the main army, mapping terrain, locating rivers, estimating enemy numbers. Messengers, riding fresh horses at each station, carried information across vast distances with astonishing speed. The Khan often knew more about his enemies than they knew about him. Knowledge became as much a weapon as bows and swords. Psychology was also a tool. Stories of Mongol speed and cruelty spread quickly. Sometimes, before a battle even began, fear weakened the enemy. Entire towns surrendered without a fight, hoping to avoid destruction. Discipline and reputation worked together, making the Mongol army appear larger and more unstoppable than it often was. What made these strategies remarkable was their consistency. Other tribes had used raids, surprise, and deception before. But Genghis Khan turned them into a system, applying them with discipline across his entire army. No longer were these tricks of individual warriors. They became the standard of a unified force. The combination of organization, discipline, strategy, and mobility created an army unlike any other in its time. It was not the largest nor the best equipped, but it was the most efficient, the most disciplined, and the most adaptable. Under Genghis Khan's leadership, it became a tool capable of breaking kingdoms, crossing deserts, and reaching lands far beyond the steppe. On the plains of Mongolia, where once only small raids had occurred, a new pattern of war was emerging. Calm, precise, relentless, each man bound to his comrades, each commander bound to his Khan, each strategy serving not just survival, but expansion. In the stillness of the steppe, a machine of war was being shaped, one that would carry the name of Genghis Khan across continents. Behind the thunder of hooves and the clash of battle, there was the quiet rhythm of daily life. For the Mongol warrior, existence was not only about war, it was also about the routines that filled the long hours between campaigns, the simple acts of survival on the open steppe, and the habits that made them strong and enduring. Their days were shaped by their animals, by the seasons, and by the constant movement of nomadic life. A Mongol warrior was, above all, a rider. From childhood, he had learned to sit on a horse almost before he could walk. By adulthood, he could ride for days, guiding his horse with ease, shooting arrows while galloping, and resting in the saddle when needed. Horses were more than transport. They were companions, providers, and protectors. A warrior might keep several mounts, rotating them to preserve their strength. Each horse had its own character, its own endurance, and warriors knew them well, speaking to them, caring for them, and depending on them completely. Food was simple, but it was enough. The diet of a Mongol warrior came mostly from livestock: milk, cheese, dried meat, and curds. Fermented mare's milk, known as airag, was a common drink, sour and refreshing. When traveling long distances, warriors carried dried meat that could last for weeks, and they knew how to survive on very little. In extreme cases, they would take nourishment from their horses, drawing small amounts of blood to drink, mixing it with milk to stay alive. This practice shocked outsiders, but for the Mongols, it was simply another way to endure the harshness of the steppe. Clothing was practical. Warriors wore long coats called deel, made from wool or leather, tied with a belt at the waist. The deel protected them from wind, from cold, and from heat. Boots were sturdy, made for riding, and could endure long journeys. In winter, fur was added for warmth. Armor was often light, sometimes made of hardened leather, sometimes reinforced with small metal plates. Protection was important. But mobility was always valued more. Rest came in small moments. On long journeys, warriors could sleep in the saddle, leaning against their horses' necks. At night, they gathered around fires, eating, drinking, and sharing stories. Music was part of life, too. Simple instruments, like the horsehead fiddle, carried songs across the camp. These songs spoke of ancestors, of battles, of love, and of the endless sky above them. Even warriors found comfort in music, a reminder that life was not only about hardship. Weapons were cared for with precision. The composite bow, made of wood, horn, and sinew, was their most prized tool. Each bow was powerful, capable of sending arrows far and with great force. Warriors practiced daily, keeping their aim sharp. Swords, lances, and knives were also part of their equipment. But the bow defined the Mongol way of war. Every man, no matter his rank, carried one, and every man was expected to master it. The life of a warrior was also about discipline. Rules were clear. Loot was divided fairly. Commands were obeyed. Disobedience brought punishment, but fairness brought trust. This discipline extended into daily routines. Warriors shared tasks, watching herds, guarding the camp, preparing food. Each man carried responsibility, and each man depended on the others. The bond of the Arban, the unit of 10, was lived not only in battle, but also in the quiet duties of everyday life. Religion and belief played their part. Warriors lived under the gaze of the eternal blue sky. The spirit that they believed watched over the steppe. Shamans performed rituals, offering guidance and protection. Before battles, offerings might be made, and prayers spoken. Even in the ordinary days of camp life, the sky above was a reminder of forces greater than men, a constant presence stretching over every horizon. Despite the hardships, there was also a sense of freedom. The Mongol warrior lived without walls, without cities, always moving, always surrounded by the vastness of the steppe. The horizon stretched endlessly, giving a sense of space that few others in the world knew. In that space, warriors found both solitude and belonging. The daily life of the Mongol warrior was not filled with luxury, but with endurance. It was simple, harsh, and disciplined. Yet it created men who could ride for weeks, fight without pause, and survive where others would fail. These habits, repeated day after day, made them into a force that could not easily be broken. When the world later looked upon the Mongol armies and wondered how they had crossed deserts, mountains, and continents, the answer lay in these daily routines. In the quiet care of horses, in the simple meals of milk and meat, in the discipline of shared duty, and in the endless practice of bow and ride. This was the life of the warrior. It was unremarkable in appearance, but it was the foundation of an empire. When Temüjin became Genghis Khan, his authority was still fragile. The title gave him recognition, but recognition alone could not feed his people or protect his herds. On the steppe, survival depended on action. And so, the first test of his leadership came not in great conquests, but in small raid strikes against neighboring clans. Battles for livestock, and contests for honor. These early raids were the proving ground where his strategies, his discipline, and his vision would be tested. A raid on the steppe was both simple and complex. To outsiders, it might seem nothing more than a sudden attack on herds or camps. But for the Mongols, raids were woven into the fabric of life. They were a way to measure strength, to prove loyalty, to gain resources, and to build reputation. Success in a raid brought food, animals, and prestige. Failure meant humiliation, weakness, and vulnerability. Temüjin prepared carefully. His men were few compared to larger tribes, but they were disciplined. Each warrior had his place. Each unit knew its role. Scouts rode ahead, moving silently across the grasslands, watching for signs of enemy herds or camps. They noted the paths of rivers, the grazing grounds of horses, and the patterns of movement. Knowledge came first, for without it, speed and strength meant little. When the moment came, the attack was swift. Riders appeared suddenly on the horizon, arrows whistling through the air before the enemy could gather. Horses thundered across the plains, warriors circling, dividing, striking at herds and guards. The chaos of surprise often broke the enemy quickly. Animals scattered, men fled, and before the defenders could organize, the raiders had taken what they needed. Then, just as suddenly, they disappeared, vanishing into the vastness of the steppe. For Temüjin and his companions, these raids were more than acts of survival. They were lessons. Each raid tested discipline. Would the men follow orders? Would they resist the urge to scatter, to chase recklessly, to take spoils for themselves? Each raid tested loyalty. Would they return to their leader, or would they desert once they had gained what they wanted? Each raid tested leadership. Could Temüjin hold them together, reward them fairly, and keep their trust? The first raids were not against powerful kingdoms, but against rival clans neighbors who had once abandoned Temüjin's family, or who threatened his growing influence. Some of these enemies remembered him as the son of Yasuge, the boy who had been left to starve. Now they faced him as a Khan, leading disciplined men who struck with speed and purpose. The victories were small in scale, but they carried symbolic weight. They showed that Genghis Khan was not a leader in name only. He could act, he could win, and he could protect his people. These raids also brought resources. Herds of horses and sheep gave food, milk, and wealth. Captured supplies filled the camps. Each success strengthened the group, giving them the means to survive and to prepare for greater campaigns. Step by step, raid by raid, Genghis Khan's people grew stronger. The enemy tribes took notice. Some feared him, others respected him. A few began to consider alliances, seeing in him not just a rival but a leader who might unify the steppe. Reputation spread quietly, carried by stories told around fires, whispered across camps. The boy who had once been abandoned was now a Khan who commanded raids with precision and fairness. These early raids were also a test of mercy. At times, prisoners were taken. Some were killed, but others were given a choice: serve Genghis Khan or return defeated. Those who joined him discovered that loyalty brought rewards. Those who opposed him found that betrayal carried punishment. In this way, even the raids became lessons in justice. For the men who rode with him, the raids created a bond. They shared the danger, the excitement, and the relief of returning safely. Around the fires at night, they retold the stories, each man remembering his part. These shared memories became part of their identity, binding them together more strongly than blood. The first raids of Genghis Khan did not shape empires or topple cities. They were small, almost unnoticed beyond the steppe. Yet within them lay the seeds of something far greater. They proved that discipline could overcome chaos, that loyalty could be stronger than fear, and that a leader could rise not by birthright, but by action. In the endless plains, where the wind carried away the sound of hooves and silence returned quickly after battle, Genghis Khan began his journey not with glory, but with raids, small sparks in the darkness, foreshadowing the fire that would one day spread across the world. The early raids had strengthened Genghis Khan and his followers. Herds had grown, supplies had been secured, and reputation had begun to spread across the steppe. But raids against small clans could not last forever. To prove himself fully and to expand his power, Temüjin had to face larger rivals. the established Khanates that held sway over vast stretches of land, resources, and warriors. These were not mere neighbors. They were powerful lords of the steppe, and they had no desire to see a rising leader challenge their authority. One of the first great tests came with the Teoshard, a formidable tribe that had once held power over Temüjin's family. They remembered him as a child, abandoned after the death of his father. Now they saw him rising, gathering men, and claiming authority as Genghis Khan. To them, this was not only a threat, but an insult. Conflict was inevitable. The battles against the Teoshard were fierce. They outnumbered Temüjin's men, and they fought with determination to crush him before his influence could spread further. Yet Temüjin relied not on numbers, but on discipline and strategy. His units of tens, hundreds, and thousands moved with coordination. They feigned retreats, lured enemies into traps, and struck swiftly where defenses were weak. Still, victory did not come easily. Temüjin was even captured at one point, bound with a wooden collar as a prisoner of his enemies. But his resolve never broke, and with the help of a sympathetic guard, he escaped. This survival became part of his legend, reinforcing the belief that destiny favored him. Other rivals soon tested him. The Merkits, a powerful tribe, had once kidnapped his wife Bert, an act that left a lasting mark on his life. Temüjin, with the help of allies, launched a campaign to rescue her. The struggle against the Merkits was personal as well as political. It showed that Genghis Khan would not forget betrayal, nor forgive easily. His determination to rescue Bert not only restored his honor, but also strengthened his reputation as a leader who protected his family and repaid debts in kind. The Khwarezmians, led by the powerful Togrul Khan, were another significant force. At times, Temüjin allied with them, seeking strength through partnership. At other times, rivalries and mistrust turned them into enemies. The shifting alliances of the steppe meant that yesterday's friend could become tomorrow's foe. Genghis Khan navigated this unstable world carefully, using diplomacy when possible, force when necessary. The greatest challenge, however, came from the Nayman, one of the most powerful tribes of the steppe. Their armies were large, their traditions deep, and their khans respected. To defeat them required not only courage, but also unity among Temüjin's followers and allies. The battles were hard-fought, with horsemen clashing across wide plains, arrows darkening the sky, and warriors charging with lances and sabers. Steppe warfare was fast and brutal, and each side sought to outmaneuver the other with speed and deception. In the end, it was Genghis Khan's discipline and organization that turned the tide. Where the Nayman and others often relied on sheer numbers and chaotic charges, his forces moved with precision. Orders were followed, units supported one another, and the structure of tens, hundreds, and thousands held firm. Gradually, through patience and persistence, the rivals were broken. These victories did more than bring him power. They brought him legitimacy, with the defeat of the Teoshard, the Merkits, the Khwarezmians, and eventually the Nayman. Genghis Khan demonstrated that he was not merely a raider or a rising leader. He was the strongest Khan of the steppe, capable of defeating the greatest rivals and uniting the tribes under his command. The struggles were long, marked by both setbacks and triumphs. Yet each confrontation added to his reputation. Stories spread of his resilience, his discipline, and his fairness to those who remained loyal. Even former enemies, when captured, sometimes chose to join him, drawn by the promise of reward and the certainty of justice. The steppe, once divided into countless rival clans and khanates, began to change. Unity, fragile but growing, formed under his leadership. For the first time, the dream of bringing the entire Mongol steppe under one rule seemed possible. In the quiet after battle, when the horses grazed and the fires burned low, the men around him must have felt the shift. Their leader was no longer only Temüjin, the boy who had suffered betrayal. He was no longer only the young Khan who led small raids. He was becoming the master of the steppe, a force that even the greatest Khonites could not resist. The battles against the Taishiod, the Merkits, the Kerite, and the Naman were not small skirmishes. They were great struggles for the future of the steppe. For generations, no single leader had united all the Mongol tribes. The clans remained divided, each with its own Khan, each with its own loyalties and rivalries. But through discipline, through patience, and through determination, Genghis Khan achieved what no one before him had managed. He brought the tribes together under one banner. The decisive victories came slowly, one after another, until there were no great rivals left to challenge his power. The defeat of the Taishiod showed that his enemies could not hold him down. His triumph over the Merkits avenged his family's honor and restored his wife, Bert. His shifting relationship with the Kerite, first as allies, then as adversaries, proved that diplomacy and force could work together. And finally, his victory over the Naman sealed his authority. The Naman were strong, respected, and deeply rooted in the traditions of the steppe. Their defeat sent a message to all. There was no Khan stronger than Genghis Khan. After these victories, the tribes of Mongolia faced a choice. They could continue in the old ways, divided and weak, vulnerable to raids and betrayals. Or they could join under the rule of a single leader who promised discipline, fairness, and strength. Many chose to follow him. Even those who had once opposed him came to see that resistance meant destruction, while loyalty meant survival and reward. The Kurultai, the great council of the Mongols, met once again. Here, the leaders and warriors of the tribes gathered. They sat in circles, their horses tied nearby, their banners fluttering in the wind. And in this assembly, they recognized Genghis Khan not only as a Khan among others, but as the Khagan, the great Khan, ruler of all Mongols. It was a moment both symbolic and practical. Symbolic because it marked the unification of a people who had long been divided. Practical because it created an authority that could direct thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, with a single voice. From that moment, the Mongols were no longer a scattered collection of clans. They were an empire in the making. Their territory was vast, stretching across the steppes, their warriors disciplined, their leadership strong. Under Genghis Khan, they were prepared not only to survive, but to expand. The victories that made this possible were not just military, they were also moral. Genghis Khan had shown his people that loyalty by merit was stronger than loyalty by birth. He had shown them that fairness in reward created trust, and that strict discipline created unity. He had shown them that betrayal could not be tolerated, but loyalty would be remembered and honored. These lessons, drawn from his own struggles, had become the foundation of his rule. The unification of the Mongols was, in itself, a remarkable achievement. For centuries, the tribes had fought and feuded. Leaders had risen and fallen, but none had managed to bring them all together. The steppe seemed destined to remain divided forever. Yet, by the end of these decisive victories, a new reality had emerged. The Mongols were united, and they had a leader who would not stop at the borders of the steppe. For the men who followed him, these victories were more than political. They were personal. They had endured hunger, hardship, and danger. They had seen their leader captured and escaped. They had fought in battles where defeat seemed certain, only to triumph through discipline and cunning. Now, as they looked across the plains, they could feel the change. They were no longer just warriors of clans. They were soldiers of an empire. The empire was still young, still fragile, still dependent on the loyalty of its people and the strength of its leader. But it was real. It had been born in fire and blood, in raids and battles, in betrayal and loyalty. It had been forged in the endless grasslands, under the eternal blue sky. The victories of Genghis Khan did not end with the unification of the Mongols. They were only the beginning. Beyond the steppe lay kingdoms, cities, and empires far larger and richer than anything the Mongols had known. The world beyond the horizon was waiting, and now, with an army united, disciplined, and loyal, Genghis Khan was ready to reach for it. When the Mongol tribes had finally been united under Genghis Khan, the horizon seemed wider than ever. The steppe, which had once been divided by rivalries, was now his to command. But Genghis Khan's vision did not end with the plains of Mongolia. Beyond the mountains and deserts lay cities, kingdoms, and empires, places filled with wealth, trade, and power. Among the first great targets of Mongol expansion was the world of Central Asia, home to Muslim kingdoms whose influence stretched across trade routes and fertile lands. One of the most powerful states in this region was the Khwarezmian Empire. It controlled vast territories, including cities along the Silk Road. These cities were not like the nomadic camps of the steppe. They were permanent, with walls, markets, and bustling populations. They were places of trade where goods from China, India, Persia, and beyond passed through. For the Mongols, who had long lived without cities, such places were both fascinating and tempting. They represented not only wealth, but also opportunity. At first, Genghis Khan did not seek war with the Khwarezmian Empire. He sought trade. Envoys were sent, bearing gifts and messages of peace. The Mongols wanted access to the Silk Road to exchange horses, hides, and other steppe goods for the silks, spices, and treasures of the cities. For a moment, it seemed possible that an alliance could form between the nomads of the steppe and the merchants of Central Asia. But suspicion and arrogance stood in the way. The Shah of Khwarezm distrusted the Mongols, viewing them as barbarians from the east. When Genghis Khan's envoys arrived, they were treated not as honored messengers, but as threats. Some were executed, others humiliated. This act of betrayal could not be ignored. For Genghis Khan, who placed great value on loyalty and justice, the killing of envoys was an insult beyond forgiveness. The response was swift and devastating. The Mongol armies crossed into Central Asia, moving with the same discipline and speed that had brought them victory on the steppe. But this time, they faced not open plains, but fortified cities with walls of stone and brick. The challenge was new, yet Genghis Khan adapted. Siege engines were built, engineers from conquered lands were employed, and strategies of encirclement and starvation were used. City after city fell. Bukhara, a jewel of Islamic culture, was captured. Genghis Khan is said to have entered its great mosque, addressing the people not as a destroyer, but as an instrument of destiny. Samarkand, another rich city, was also taken after fierce resistance. The Mongols showed both cunning and ruthlessness. Sometimes they spared those who surrendered quickly. Other times they destroyed entire populations, sending a message of fear that traveled faster than their armies. For the people of Central Asia, the arrival of the Mongols was both shocking and terrifying. They had heard of the horsemen from the east, but few believed they could overcome great cities with high walls. Yet the discipline of the Mongol army, combined with their mobility and their willingness to adapt, proved unstoppable. Walls crumbled, gates were broken, and resistance was crushed. These campaigns were not only about conquest, they reshaped the balance of power along the Silk Road. With each victory, the Mongols gained control of new territories, new trade routes, and new resources. Their empire, once limited to the grasslands, now touched the rich cities of the Islamic world. For Genghis Khan, this expansion was more than victory. It was a statement. The Mongols were no longer a people confined to the steppe. They were a force that could move across deserts, mountains, and fortified walls. Yet the campaigns also revealed the darker side of conquest. Entire populations were displaced, cities burned, and survivors forced into exile. The stories of destruction spread across the Muslim world, filling markets and mosques with fear. Some saw the Mongols as a punishment sent from heaven, others as a storm sweeping across the earth. For the Mongol warriors themselves, these campaigns were both challenging and rewarding. They experienced cities larger than any they had seen before, filled with goods and wonders unknown on the steppe. They also faced dangers, disease, resistance, and the difficulty of fighting in unfamiliar terrain. Yet each victory confirmed their belief in their leader, in their discipline, and in the destiny of their people. By the end of these first campaigns in Central Asia, the map of the region had changed forever. The Khwarezmian Empire, once powerful and proud, had been broken. Trade routes that had once belonged to others were now under Mongol control, and the name of Genghis Khan was carried westward, whispered in fear and awe, a name that no one could ignore. For centuries, the Mongols had lived in the wide openness of the steppe. Their world was built on movement, on herds, on tents that could be packed and carried, on skies that stretched endlessly above them. But as Genghis Khan's armies crossed into Central Asia, they encountered a different world. This was a world of cities, fixed, permanent, filled with stone walls, crowded markets, and the sounds of life lived in one place rather than on the move. The meeting of steppe and city was more than a clash of armies. It was a clash of cultures, of ways of life, of visions of what it meant to live. The Mongols found the cities both fascinating and alien. Two men who had grown up in yurts, the sight of massive walls rising out of the desert was astonishing. Gates of iron and wood stood higher than anything they had ever built. Towers and minarets pierced the skyline, and markets stretched through narrow streets filled with voices, colors, and scents. Where the steppe offered silence and space, the city offered noise and crowding. For some Mongol warriors, these places seemed like wonders. For others, they seemed like traps. The city dwellers, too, saw the Mongols as strange. To them, the horsemen from the steppe seemed wild, uncivilized, lacking the refinements of settled life. They had no stone houses, no written records of their own, no permanent temples. They lived in tents, moving from place to place, carrying their wealth in herds rather than coins. The contrast was stark, and each side viewed the other through lenses of suspicion and misunderstanding. Religion reflected this divide. The Mongols followed the eternal blue sky, with shamans guiding rituals and offering prayers to spirits. Their spirituality was tied to the land, the animals, and the heavens. The Muslim cities, on the other hand, were filled with mosques, scholars, and the words of the Quran. Faith was central to their lives, shaping laws, learning, and daily routines. To the Mongols, these practices seemed formal and complex. To the Muslims, the Mongol beliefs appeared primitive. Yet the Mongols adapted quickly. They did not dismiss what they saw. Instead, they absorbed what was useful. Engineers from conquered cities were employed to build siege engines. Artisans were kept alive to produce goods. Administrators were used to manage populations. The Mongols were pragmatic. They cared less about culture for its own sake, and more about how it could serve the needs of conquest and control. The contrast between nomadic freedom and urban permanence also shaped the way the two societies fought. City dwellers trusted in their walls. Behind thick stone defenses, They felt secure, believing no force could break them. For the Mongols, walls were an obstacle but not a barrier. They circled cities, cut off supplies, and waited. They built machines of wood and rope, learned to throw stones and fire, and turned patience into victory. The city's permanence became its weakness, while the nomad's mobility became his strength. Daily life also revealed differences. In the cities, people lived surrounded by goods from distant lands. Spices, silks, and books filled the markets. Scholars debated ideas, judges settled disputes, and merchants counted coins. On the steppe, wealth was measured in horses, survival was secured by mobility, and disputes were settled by strength or loyalty. The city was a place of complexity, the steppe a place of simplicity. Yet both ways of life held their own kind of order. For the Mongols, the encounter with cities expanded their horizons. They saw the value of writing, the power of administration, and the possibilities of trade. But they never abandoned the habits of the steppe. Even when ruling over great cities, Genghis Khan preferred the yurt to the palace, the open air to the enclosed room, the movement of herds to the stillness of markets. He could use the city, but he never became part of it. The clash between steppe and city was not only about war, it was about identity. The Mongols would conquer cities, but they would remain nomads. The people of the cities would fear and resist the Mongols, but they could not ignore them. The two worlds collided, intertwined, and reshaped one another. In the end, the Mongol Empire became a bridge between these worlds. Steppe warriors ruled over urban populations, bringing together traditions that had once seemed incompatible. The nomad and the city dweller remained different, but under Genghis Khan, their destinies became linked. The clash of cultures became not just a struggle, but also a transformation. As the Mongols expanded into Central Asia, they entered lands filled with beliefs and traditions different from their own. On the steppe, faith was tied to the eternal blue sky, to the spirits of the earth, the wind, and the ancestors. Shamans guided rituals, offering sacrifices, reading omens, and speaking with the unseen. Religion was simple, practical, and closely connected to the rhythms of nomadic life. But in the cities they conquered, faith was more formal, structured, and vast in its reach. Mosques, churches, and temples stood as reminders of organized belief, guiding the daily lives of settled peoples. For many conquerors, such differences might have been a reason for suppression, yet Genghis Khan chose another path. His empire was too diverse, too wide, too filled with varied traditions to be ruled by one single faith. Instead, he practiced something rare for his time: religious tolerance. The Mongols allowed conquered peoples to keep their religions. Muslims continued to pray in their mosques. Christians worshipped in their churches. Buddhists and Taoists kept their temples. Shamans continued their rituals under the open sky. Rather than forcing one faith on all, Genghis Khan demanded only loyalty to his rule. As long as taxes were paid and rebellion avoided, belief was free. This tolerance was not born of charity alone. It was also practical. The Mongols knew that unity could not come from religion in an empire that stretched across cultures. Instead, unity had to come from discipline, from law, and from loyalty to the great Khan. By respecting different religions, Genghis Khan reduced resistance. Priests, imams, monks, and shamans were spared, their roles preserved, so that people might accept Mongol rule more easily. At his court, representatives of many faiths were welcomed. There were Muslim scholars, Christian monks, Buddhist lamas, and shamans of the steppe. Debates sometimes took place, each presenting their beliefs. But the Khan did not choose one over the other. To him, all were equal under the eternal blue sky. What mattered most was order, stability, and loyalty. The Mongols also adapted, taking from other religions what they found useful. From Buddhism, they absorbed ideas of law and morality. From Islam, they admired scholarship and trade. From Christianity, they encountered stories of faith and endurance. These influences did not replace their own beliefs, but they enriched the Mongol world, making it more flexible, more open, and more connected. This policy of tolerance strengthened the empire. Where other conquerors faced endless rebellions caused by forced conversions, the Mongols avoided much of this unrest. People learned that under the Khan's rule they could keep their gods, their rituals, their sacred texts. All that was required was obedience in matters of law and loyalty. This balance created a stability that allowed the empire to grow far beyond the steppe. Yet tolerance had limits. Rebellion was never forgiven, no matter the faith. A city that resisted might be destroyed, its temples burned, its people scattered. Tolerance was a gift for the loyal, not a shield for the defiant. In this way, Genghis Khan made it clear that respect for religion existed within the framework of obedience. Faith was free, but rebellion was punished without mercy. For the Mongol warriors themselves, this openness was less a matter of philosophy and more a matter of experience. As they traveled farther, they saw more of the world, different gods, different rituals, different prayers rising into the same sky. Many must have felt curiosity, perhaps even wonder, at the sight of great mosques, vast monasteries, or sacred statues. Yet, in their hearts, they still looked to the sky above, to the spirits of their ancestors, to the traditions of the steppe. The result of this tolerance was profound. The Mongol Empire became not just the largest in size, but also one of the most diverse in culture and faith. It connected lands that had once been separated by belief, making it possible for trade, knowledge, and ideas to flow across continents. Merchants could travel the Silk Road without fear of persecution. Scholars could share knowledge from one end of the empire to the other. The world grew smaller, more connected, under Mongol rule. For Genghis Khan, tolerance was not weakness. It was strength. It was a way to rule not only through fear, but also through acceptance. It was a way to create an empire where different peoples could live under one banner without constant rebellion. In the endless diversity of his realm, he saw not chaos, but opportunity. And so, under the eternal blue sky, the Mongol Empire became a place where many gods were worshipped. Many prayers were spoken, and many traditions were preserved. The Khan ruled over them all, not as a prophet, not as a priest, but as a leader who understood that power lay not in forcing one belief, but in allowing many. To the south of the Mongolian steppe lay one of the most enduring civilizations in history. China. For centuries, Chinese dynasties had built walls, raised armies, and established trade routes that stretched across Asia. The Mongols, riding in the open grasslands, had long known of the riches of their southern neighbor. Traders brought silk, porcelain, tea, and fine goods northward, while horses and furs traveled in the other direction. The relationship was old, but it was never equal. The Chinese kingdoms viewed the steppe peoples as outsiders, sometimes as trading partners, often as threats, and always as barbarians living beyond the borders of their ordered world. By the time Genghis Khan rose to power, China was divided. In the north, the Jin Dynasty ruled over powerful cities, fortified walls, and millions of subjects. In the south, the Song Dynasty maintained its own rule, with wealth and culture flourishing in cities along rivers and fertile lands. Between these dynasties and the Mongols lay smaller states, borderlands where cultures mixed, and where tension often simmered. The Mongols' first direct contact with the Chinese was not through diplomacy, but through raids. Small groups of horsemen crossed into northern territories, testing defenses, seizing goods, and retreating quickly into the safety of the steppe. These early encounters were not yet great invasions, but they sent a message. The steppe was watching, and its warriors were willing to strike. For the Mongols, the Chinese world must have seemed astonishing. Cities rose higher than any structures on the steppe. Walls stretched for miles, guarded by soldiers armed with crossbows, weapons capable of piercing armor at great distances. Markets overflowed with goods, from fine fabrics to intricate ceramics. Scholars filled libraries, writing books and recording histories. To a people accustomed to mobility and simplicity, the scale and permanence of Chinese civilization was both fascinating and intimidating. The Chinese, in turn, had long feared the riders of the north. Their dynasties had built the Great Wall and its many extensions precisely to keep out nomadic raiders. They knew that the horsemen of the steppe were fast, skilled, and relentless. Yet many Chinese rulers underestimated Genghis Khan. They had seen raiders before, but they had never seen a leader who could unite the tribes into a single, disciplined army. The first Mongol raids into Chinese territory tested more than walls. They tested strategies. The Jin Dynasty relied on strong defenses, fortified gates, and large numbers of infantry. The Mongols relied on speed, mobility, and deception. At first, neither side truly understood the other. The Chinese believed their walls would hold. The Mongols believed their horses could outrun and outmaneuver any force. The clashes that followed would teach both sides new lessons. Trade and diplomacy also played a role. Even as raids occurred, envoys traveled between the two worlds. Merchants carried goods across the border, sometimes legally, sometimes secretly. Tribute was sometimes offered by smaller states, seeking protection either from the Chinese dynasties or from the Mongols. This mixture of conflict and exchange was typical of the frontier. War and trade existed side by side, each shaping the other. For Genghis Khan, the contact with China was more than an opportunity for plunder. It was a test of his vision. Could the methods that had united the steppe and defeated Central Asian kingdoms also succeed against one of the oldest and richest civilizations on Earth? Could speed and discipline overcome walls and numbers? Could nomads conquer cities larger than anything they had ever seen? The early encounters did not provide final answers, but they set the stage. Each raid, each clash, each negotiation revealed strengths and weaknesses. The Mongols learned how the Chinese fought, how they defended, and how they organized their armies. The Chinese began to realize that the Mongols were not just raiders. They were an emerging power, disciplined, united, and led by a Khan who thought beyond the traditions of the steppe. For the warriors who rode with Genghis Khan, these first contacts were filled with wonder and challenge. They saw the walls of Chinese cities rise above them, more massive than anything they had known. They tasted goods unknown on the steppe. They fought soldiers who used weapons they had never seen before, and yet, through it all, they remained what they had always been, riders of the steppe, loyal to their Khan, disciplined in their units, confident in their speed. The horizon had shifted. No longer was the Mongol struggle only against rival clans or neighboring Khanates. Now, it was against one of the greatest civilizations in history. The first contacts with China were only the beginning, but they marked a turning point. For Genghis Khan, the path of conquest no longer stopped at the steppe. It reached into the heart of empires, testing his vision against the weight of centuries. The first raids into northern China had been small, testing the defenses of the Jin Dynasty. But soon, Genghis Khan began to plan something larger. He was no longer content with skirmishes or border raids. He wanted full campaigns, organized invasions that would bring cities under his control and extend Mongol power deep into Chinese lands. The Jin Dynasty was strong, wealthy, and confident behind its walls. Its cities were massive, filled with soldiers, merchants, and farmers. Its rulers believed that their fortifications and their great numbers would protect them from nomadic horsemen. Yet Genghis Khan saw weaknesses. He understood that walls could be overcome, that fear could spread faster than armies, and that discipline could defeat numbers. The Mongol army advanced southward, moving with speed across the open plains of northern China. At first, the Chinese relied on their usual defenses. Gates were closed, walls were manned, and supplies were stored inside cities. The Mongols, however, had adapted from their campaigns in Central Asia. They brought engineers who could build siege engines. They learned to use catapults, towers, and rams. What had once been an obstacle now became an opportunity for innovation. The sieges were long and difficult. Cities resisted fiercely, believing their walls would save them. But the Mongols were patient. They encircled the cities, cutting off supplies, waiting as hunger and fear weakened those inside. Sometimes they used captured enemies as shields, forcing defenders to choose between striking at their foes or harming their own people. Other times, they set fire to gates or tunneled beneath walls, bringing down great fortifications stone by stone. One of the first major victories came with the capture of Zhongdu, the Jin capital, known today as Beijing. The city was vast, defended by strong walls and thousands of soldiers. Yet even Zhongdu could not withstand the relentless pressure of the Mongols. After a long siege, the city fell. Its riches were taken, its people scattered, and its defenses destroyed. The fall of Zhongdu shocked the Jin Dynasty and the world beyond. It showed that even the greatest cities could be broken. The Mongol campaigns in China were not only about military conquest, they were also about learning. The Mongols observed how the Chinese organized their armies, how they managed supplies, how they used crossbows and gunpowder weapons. Each encounter taught them something new. Genghis Khan valued knowledge as much as victory. Engineers, scholars, and craftsmen were spared, taken into Mongol service, and used to strengthen future campaigns. The Chinese people experienced these invasions with fear and awe. To them, the Mongols seemed unstoppable riders, who appeared suddenly, who moved faster than news could travel, who struck with precision and then vanished into the steppe. Stories of Mongol cruelty spread quickly. Entire towns surrendered without resistance, hoping to avoid destruction. In some places, this spared lives. In others, resistance led to harsh retribution, leaving ruins as a warning to others. For the Mongol warriors, the campaigns were both challenging and rewarding. They faced enemies who fought with different tactics, behind walls, with weapons unfamiliar to the steppe. Yet each victory confirmed their faith in their Khan. The spoils of war brought wealth. The success of sieges brought pride. The discipline of their army proved itself again and again. These campaigns also revealed the contrast between the nomadic and the settled world. Even as the Mongols captured cities, they did not settle in them. Genghis Khan himself preferred his yurt to the palaces of China. His court remained mobile, moving with the seasons, living as nomads always had. The Mongols ruled the cities, but they did not become city dwellers. They remained riders of the steppe, carrying their traditions even as they commanded foreign lands. By the end of these great campaigns, the Jin dynasty was weakened, its northern territories shattered. The Mongols had shown that no wall was unbreakable, no city beyond their reach. The victories in China were more than territorial gains. They were proof that the Mongol way of war, the speed, the discipline, the adaptability could defeat even the most advanced civilizations. For the world beyond, the message was clear. The Mongols were no longer just a steppe people. They were an empire in motion, stretching from the deserts of Central Asia to the cities of China, and their Khan Genghis was no longer only a leader of tribes. He was becoming a conqueror of kingdoms. The Mongol conquests in northern China were not only about battles and sieges, they were also about learning. For generations, the Mongols had lived as nomads, moving with their herds, guided by the seasons, guided by the wind. They had no written script of their own, no permanent cities, no large bureaucracy. Their strength had always been mobility, discipline, and resilience. But when Genghis Khan's armies captured Chinese cities, they discovered something new: an entire world of knowledge, skill, and organization that was unlike anything they had known before. The Chinese dynasties had spent centuries perfecting the arts of administration. Their empires were vast, and to govern them required careful systems. Taxes were collected, records were kept, roads were maintained, and officials were appointed. The Mongols had never needed such systems. A nomadic camp was small, and leadership was personal. Orders could be given directly, and justice could be carried out quickly. But to rule over cities filled with thousands, even millions, of people, something more was required. Genghis Khan understood this. He was not a man who clung blindly to tradition. He valued what was useful. When he conquered Chinese cities, he did not destroy every trace of their systems. Instead, he studied them. He kept administrators alive, using their skills to manage taxes and records. He preserved the knowledge of writing, the use of paper, and the methods of organization. These tools, once foreign to the steppe, became part of his empire. The same was true of engineering. On the open plains, the Mongols had little need for siege engines or stone walls. But in China, they faced cities protected by massive fortifications. To overcome them, they needed new tools. Chinese engineers provided these. Catapults were built to hurl stones against walls. Siege towers were constructed to allow warriors to climb over defenses. Techniques for digging tunnels and undermining walls were learned and applied. The Mongols were quick learners. They did not dismiss foreign knowledge as strange or unnecessary. Instead, they absorbed it, adapted it, and used it. When they captured a city, they often spared the artisans, engineers, and scholars. These men were valuable. They could build weapons, create systems, and spread knowledge. While others might have destroyed such skills, Genghis Khan preserved them, weaving them into the fabric of his growing empire. The integration of Chinese knowledge changed the Mongols. It made their army stronger, more adaptably capable of facing fortified cities. It made their empire more stable, able to manage taxes, trade, and laws across vast distances. It allowed them to rule not only the steppe, but also the cities and farmlands beyond it. Yet, even as they absorbed these influences, the Mongols did not abandon their own ways. Genghis Khan continued to live in a yurt, moving with the seasons, preferring the open air to the enclosed walls of palaces. His court remained mobile, his army always ready to ride. The knowledge of China was not used to change the nomadic way of life. It was used to strengthen it, to make it capable of ruling far beyond its original borders. For the Chinese people, this was both surprising and unsettling. They saw their own systems, developed over centuries, now being used by the very people they had once called barbarians. They saw their engineers, their administrators, their scholars taken into Mongol service. Some resisted, others adapted, and some even found opportunity in serving the new rulers. The Mongols, though foreign, were not blind destroyers. They were builders of a new order, one that combined the strength of the steppe with the knowledge of the city. The impact of this integration was lasting. The Mongol Empire became not only vast in territory, but also sophisticated in its administration. Roads were maintained, trade was protected, messages traveled quickly, and conquered peoples were governed with surprising efficiency. The combination of nomadic discipline and Chinese organization created a system capable of holding together lands from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea. For the Mongol warriors, the sight of siege engines, of paper records, of officials and scribes must have seemed strange. Yet they trusted their leader. They trusted that these new tools, these new systems, were not a threat to their way of life, but a strength to their empire. And so they accepted them, just as they had accepted discipline, fairness, and loyalty. The early encounters with China were more than battles. They were moments of learning, of adaptation, of transformation. Genghis Khan took the knowledge of cities and used it to strengthen the traditions of the steppe. In doing so, he built an empire that was not only vast in size, but also resilient in structure. Under the eternal blue sky, the steppe had shaped him. In the cities of China, knowledge reshaped his empire. From this union of mobility and administration, of steppe and city, a new power was born, one that would stretch farther than either world had ever imagined. An empire as vast as the one Genghis Khan was building could not survive on strength alone. Armies could conquer, horses could travel, and cities could fall. But without order, the victories would crumble into chaos. Genghis Khan understood this. He knew that loyalty and discipline needed a foundation deeper than fear of punishment or hope of reward. He needed rules that applied not just to warriors, but to families, to merchants, and to all who lived under the eternal blue sky. Out of this need came the Yasa, the code of law that bound the Mongol Empire together. The Yasa was not written down in books, as Chinese or Islamic laws were. It was a living code, preserved through memory, through recitation, and through the authority of the Khan. Its origins are partly hidden in legend. Some say that Genghis Khan created it after uniting the Mongol tribes, as a way of ensuring that the old rivalries would not tear them apart again. Others believe it developed gradually, shaped by the lessons of war, loyalty, and betrayal. Whatever its origins, the Yasa became the backbone of Mongol rule. At its heart, the Yasa was about discipline and unity. In the army, disobedience was punished severely. A soldier who deserted his comrades, who disobeyed orders, or who acted without permission could be executed. But this severity was balanced by fairness. The Yasa demanded that loot be divided according to service, not according to birth. It demanded that commanders reward loyalty and that betrayal be punished without hesitation. In this way, it reinforced the principles that had already made the Mongol army strong. The Yasa also extended beyond the battlefield. It regulated daily life, shaping how people behaved in camp, in trade, and in family matters. Theft was forbidden. Adultery was punished. False testimony was condemned. Even small matters, like how food was shared or how animals were cared for, could fall under its rules. To live under the Yasa was to live in a world where order mattered, where actions had consequences, and where loyalty to the Khan was the highest duty. One striking feature of the Yasa was its impartiality. It applied to all, whether noble or common. A prince who betrayed trust could be punished as severely as a soldier. This broke with many traditions of the time, where birth determined privilege. Under the Yasa, merit and loyalty mattered more than lineage. This fairness strengthened Genghis Khan's rule, for it convinced many that he was not merely another tribal leader seeking wealth for his family, but a ruler who demanded justice for all. The Yasa also reflected the practical needs of a nomadic empire. Rules about hunting ensured that herds and wildlife were preserved. Rules about trade protected merchants traveling across long distances. Rules about hospitality reinforced the bonds between clans and ensured that travelers could find shelter. In this way, the Yasa created stability not only in war but in peace. Religion, too, was addressed by the Yasa. While Genghis Khan allowed freedom of belief, the code demanded respect for shamans, priests, monks, and imams alike. Religious leaders were often exempt from taxes, a sign of the Khan's recognition of their role in maintaining order. Yet faith itself was always subordinate to loyalty. A man could pray to any god, but he could not disobey the law of the Khan. The Yasa was more than a set of rules. It was a symbol of unity. The Mongol tribes had once been divided, each with its own customs and traditions. The Yasa created a single standard, a common code that all could recognize. It turned a collection of clans into a single people, bound not only by conquest, but by law. For the people who lived under it, the Yasa was both harsh and reassuring. It was harsh because punishments were severe, often death for crimes that might elsewhere bring lighter sentences. But it was reassuring because it was consistent. Justice did not depend on the whim of a chief or the favor of a family. It came from the Yasa, from the authority of the Khan, and it was applied to all. In the quiet of the steppe, around the fires of the camp, the Yasa was remembered and recited. In the cities newly conquered, it was introduced as the law of the new rulers. Across deserts, plains, and mountains, it carried the same message, that loyalty, discipline, and order were the foundation of the Mongol Empire. The Yasa did not survive in written form, and much of it is lost to history, but its spirit remains clear. It was the law of a leader who understood that empires are not built only on conquest, but on rules that hold people together. Under the eternal blue sky, the Yasa gave shape to the Mongol world, turning conquest into empire and loyalty into law. An empire as vast as that of Genghis Khan could not exist without rules. Armies could conquer, but armies alone could not sustain peace. Herds could feed the warriors, but herds alone could not govern cities. The eternal blue sky might give a sense of destiny, but destiny alone could not bring stability. For these reasons, Genghis Khan turned to something deeper: justice and order. The Mongols had always lived by customs. Each clan, each tribe, carried its own traditions, its own ways of resolving disputes. But these traditions were often in conflict with one another. What was acceptable in one clan might be punished in another. A marriage agreement in one place might mean nothing in the next. These differences had kept the steppe divided for generations. They had fueled rivalries, betrayals, and endless cycles of revenge. Genghis Khan wanted something different. He wanted one law for all, a single system that would bind together tribes, cities, and kingdoms under his rule. That system was the Yasa, and within the Yasa, the principles of justice and order were clear. The first principle was loyalty. In the Mongol world, loyalty was the foundation of everything. A man who was loyal to his leader could expect protection and reward. A man who betrayed that loyalty could expect punishment, swift and severe. Betrayal, no matter the reason, was considered one of the greatest crimes. It did not matter if the betrayer was a common soldier or a noble prince. The punishment was the same. In this, Genghis Khan broke with old traditions, where the powerful were often spared. Under his rule, justice was meant to be equal. The second principle was fairness in reward. When spoils were taken in raids or battles, they were divided according to contribution. No man was left out, no matter how small his role. A warrior who fought bravely could expect to share in the wealth, even if he was of humble birth. This created trust. It showed that the Khan valued merit more than ancestry. It gave men a reason to fight, knowing that their efforts would not be forgotten. The third principle was discipline in daily life. The Yasa regulated behavior not only in war, but also in peace. Theft was forbidden. Adultery was punished. False testimony was not tolerated. Even the treatment of animals was guided by rules. These laws might seem strict, even harsh, but they created order. They reminded people that actions had consequences, that life in the empire was not ruled by chance or by whim, but by law. The fourth principle was respect for religion. Genghis Khan understood that his empire was too vast, too diverse, to be bound by a single faith. Instead, the Yasa protected religious leaders. Priests, monks, and shamans were given freedom to practice, and often exempt from taxes. The message was simple: worship as you wish, but remain loyal to the Khan. In this way, justice was balanced with tolerance. People could keep their beliefs, but all were equal under the law. Justice under Genghis Khan was not gentle. Punishments could be severe. Execution was common for crimes of betrayal, theft, or disobedience. But the severity was matched by consistency. On the steppe, where leaders often ruled through personal power, justice had been uncertain. Under the Yasa, it was clear. The same rules applied to all. This consistency created stability. People knew what was expected of them, and they knew what would happen if they broke the rules. For the Mongol warriors, these principles were not abstract ideas. They were part of daily life. In the camp, food was shared fairly. In battle, orders were obeyed without question. Around the fire, stories of loyalty and betrayal were told, reminding each man of the weight of his choices. Justice was not distant. It was present in every decision, every action, every relationship. For the conquered peoples of the empire, the principles of justice brought both fear and reassurance. Fear, because punishments were harsh and rebellion was crushed without mercy. Reassurance, because the law was predictable and because it applied equally. A merchant could travel the Silk Road under Mongol rule with less fear of bandits, knowing that the law protected him. A farmer could work his fields, knowing that his crops were less likely to be stolen by raiders. The principles of justice and order transformed the Mongol Empire. They turned conquest into governance, chaos into stability, and fear into acceptance. They allowed Genghis Khan to rule not only through strength, but also through law. Under the endless sky of the steppe, beneath the stars that had watched his childhood, Genghis Khan created more than an army. He created a system where loyalty was rewarded, betrayal punished, and justice applied to all. This system, the Yasa, gave shape to his empire, and it echoed across the vast lands he conquered, binding together peoples who had once been divided. Conquering a city was one kind of victory. Governing it was another. For the Mongols, who had lived for generations without permanent settlements, the challenge of ruling vast territories was new. They knew how to ride across plains, how to herd animals, and how to survive in harsh landscapes. But now, under Genghis Khan, they commanded cities with walls, markets, and countless inhabitants. These people did not live in yurts. They lived in houses of stone and wood, in neighborhoods crowded and complex. To rule them, Genghis Khan had to create an administration that went beyond the traditions of the steppe. At first, the Mongols approached cities with suspicion. The stillness of stone walls felt unnatural to riders who had spent their lives in motion. A city seemed like a trap, a place where freedom could be lost. Yet Genghis Khan was not blinded by tradition. He saw that cities held wealth, resources, and knowledge. To destroy them entirely was to waste what could strengthen the empire. To govern them effectively was to secure lasting power. The administration of conquered lands began with order. The Yasa, the code of law, was introduced. Taxes were demanded, but often in predictable forms: grain, silk, or labor. Merchants were protected, for trade was essential to the empire. Roads were repaired, markets supervised, and officials appointed to oversee daily affairs. Where the Mongols lacked experience, they turned to the conquered themselves. Chinese administrators, Persian scribes, and other skilled officials were spared and put to work. Their knowledge became part of the Mongol system. The empire of Genghis Khan was not uniform. It was vast, stretching across deserts, mountains, forests, and cities. Each region was different. Each people followed different customs, and each land required different forms of rule. The Mongols understood this. Rather than impose a single culture, they allowed diversity to remain. Local rulers were often kept in place as long as they remained loyal and paid tribute. The Mongols provided oversight, but they did not always replace local traditions. In this way, the administration of the empire was both flexible and strict. Flexible because it allowed different peoples to keep their ways of life, their languages, and their beliefs. Strict because all were bound by loyalty to the Great Khan, and all were subject to the Yasa. The balance between freedom and control created stability. It allowed the empire to stretch across vast distances without collapsing into rebellion. The Mongols also built systems of communication. Messages had to move quickly across the empire, carrying orders, news, and reports. To make this possible, they established a network of relay stations, each with fresh horses. Messengers could travel incredible distances in a short time, passing from one station to the next, never slowing down. This system, sometimes called the Yam, connected the farthest corners of the empire. It made it possible for Genghis Khan to know what was happening in lands hundreds of miles away, and to respond with speed. Taxes and tribute were another foundation of administration. The Mongols demanded payment from conquered peoples, but they did not simply seize everything. Instead, they created systems to collect resources regularly. This allowed the empire to support its armies, maintain its roads, and secure its trade routes. While the burden could be heavy, it was often less chaotic than the random demands of previous rulers. Merchants in particular benefited, as Mongol protection made trade along the Silk Road safer and more reliable. Justice, too, was enforced. The Yasa demanded fairness and discipline. Theft, corruption, and rebellion were punished severely. Officials who abused their power could face the same penalties as common men. This strictness created fear, but also trust. People came to understand that, under Mongol rule, order would be maintained and justice would be applied without favoritism. The Mongols also encouraged the movement of people. Artisans, craftsmen, and scholars were often relocated to places where their skills were needed. A craftsman captured in one city might be sent to another, to build, to teach, to create. This movement spread knowledge across the empire, blending traditions and skills. It also reminded people that their lives were now part of something larger, something that stretched beyond the horizon. For the Mongol warriors, the administration of cities was a distant thing. They remained on the move, living in yurts, riding with their horses. Yet they saw the effects. The spoils of war became regular supplies. trade routes became safer. The empire grew stronger. Their Khan had not only conquered, he had learned to rule. The administration of the conquered lands was not without hardship. Taxes were heavy, punishments harsh, and rebellions met with brutal response. Yet, in many places, people found a measure of stability unknown before. Roads were safe. Trade flourished. Ideas moved across continents. The steppe had given birth to a conqueror, but the cities gave birth to an empire. Under the eternal blue sky, Genghis Khan transformed from a nomadic leader into a ruler of vast territories. The administration he created, flexible, strict, and pragmatically allowed the Mongols to govern lands stretching thousands of miles. It was a system that combined the traditions of the steppe with the knowledge of the city. And it was this system that turned conquest into something lasting, something enduring, something that would shape the world for centuries. By the early 13th century, the Mongol Empire had stretched far beyond the steppe. The tribes of Mongolia were united. Central Asia was under their control, and the cities of northern China had fallen to their armies. Yet Genghis Khan's vision extended even farther. Beyond deserts and mountains, across trade routes and fertile plains, lay the Khwarezmian Empire, Muslim state that ruled over Persia, parts of Central Asia, and the lands along the Silk Road. Rich in commerce and culture, it stood as one of the most powerful realms of its time. At first, Genghis Khan did not plan to conquer Khwarezm. His interests were practical. He sought trade, safe passage for merchants, and peaceful relations. Envoys were sent bearing gifts, fine goods, and messages of friendship. The Mongols offered partnership, imagining that commerce could link the two empires. For a moment, it seemed possible that peace would prevail, but suspicion poisoned the attempt. The Shah of Khwarezm, Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, looked at the Mongols not as allies, but as barbarians. To him, their empire seemed sudden, untrustworthy, and dangerous. When a caravan of Mongol merchants entered his territory, it was seized. The goods were confiscated, and the merchants were killed. Genghis Khan, still hoping for peace, sent envoys to demand justice. Instead, one of the envoys was executed, the others humiliated. This insult could not be forgiven. To Genghis Khan, the killing of envoys was more than an act of aggression. It was a betrayal of the sacred trust between rulers. On the steppe, even enemies were bound to respect messengers, for without them, no peace could ever be possible. The Shah's actions had not only denied trade, they had declared war. The Mongol response was swift and overwhelming. In 1219, Genghis Khan gathered his armies and marched westward. Across the deserts and mountains, tens of thousands of horsemen advanced. They moved with the same discipline that had crushed the tribes of the steppe and the cities of China. But now their target was an empire larger and richer than any they had yet faced. The Khwarezmian cities were strong, with walls of stone and armies of soldiers, but the Mongols had learned the art of siege. They brought engineers to build catapults, towers, and rams. They surrounded cities, cutting off supplies, starving defenders into submission. They used terror as a weapon, sparing those who surrendered quickly, but destroying those who resisted. One by one, the cities of the Khwarezmian Empire fell. The first major target was Bukhara, a center of Islamic learning and culture. When the Mongols entered, the city surrendered with little resistance. Genghis Khan is said to have addressed the people in the mosque, declaring that he was sent by the eternal blue sky to punish them for the sins of their rulers. The city was plundered, its wealth taken, its people scattered. The fall of Bukhara sent shockwaves across the Muslim world. From Bukhara, the Mongols advanced to Samarkand, another jewel of the empire. Here, Resistance was stronger, but it was crushed. Walls fell, soldiers were defeated, and the city was taken. Other towns and fortresses followed, each falling in turn, each adding to the reputation of Mongol ruthlessness and inevitability. The Shah, unable to stop the advance, fled westward, abandoning his cities to their fate. Pursued by Mongol detachments, he wandered through his empire, his authority collapsing with each defeat. Eventually, he died in exile, far from the throne he had once claimed. His empire, once strong, was shattered, reduced to ruins by the relentless advance of the horsemen from the east. The conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire was not only a military victory, it was also a turning point. It marked the moment when the Mongol Empire extended deep into the Islamic world, controlling lands from the borders of China to the edges of Persia. It demonstrated that no kingdom, no matter how rich or powerful, was beyond the reach of Genghis Khan. For the Mongol warriors, the campaign was both brutal and rewarding. They crossed new lands, saw new cities, and fought enemies unlike any they had faced before. The spoils of conquest enriched them, the victories strengthened their faith in their Khan, and the fear they inspired spread far beyond the battlefield. For the world beyond, the fall of Khwarezm was a warning. Merchants along the Silk Road carried tales of destruction. Scholars, poets, and travelers wrote of cities reduced to ashes, of survivors scattered, of an army that seemed unstoppable. The Mongols were no longer a distant power. They were a storm sweeping westward, a force that no wall, no city, no empire had yet been able to resist. The conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire revealed not only the strength of the Mongol army, but also the methods by which Genghis Khan ruled through both fear and calculation. His campaigns were not simply about force. They were about shaping perception, about sending messages across lands, about using terror and diplomacy as twin weapons. Together, they made his empire stronger than sheer numbers alone ever could. The Mongols were masters of speed and strategy, but they were also masters of reputation. Stories of their cruelty spread faster than their armies. Entire cities surrendered without a fight, not because they had seen the Mongols, but because they had heard of them. To the people of Persia, the fall of Bukhara and Samarkand was not only a loss of territory, it was a symbol of inevitability. If such great cities could fall, then no place was safe. Terror was not random, it was deliberate. When a city resisted, the Mongols destroyed it completely. Populations were massacred, survivors scattered, buildings burned. The destruction served a purpose. It warned others. A nearby town, hearing of the fate of its neighbors, might open its gates without resistance, choosing survival over defiance. In this way, the Mongols saved time and resources. By destroying a few, they controlled many. But terror was balanced with diplomacy. Genghis Khan did not desire endless destruction. He wanted submission, loyalty, and tribute. Cities that surrendered quickly were often spared. Their leaders were allowed to remain in power. Their people left alive, their markets reopened. The Mongols demanded taxes, supplies, and obedience. But in return they offered stability and protection. For merchants along the Silk Road, this was valuable. Under Mongol rule, trade routes became safer than they had been in generations. The combination of terror and diplomacy created a pattern. A city faced a choice: resist and risk annihilation, or surrender and survive. Many chose surrender. This choice was not easy. Fear and pride often urged resistance, but the stories of Mongol vengeance made the alternative too terrible to ignore. Envoys played a central role in this strategy. Genghis Khan treated them as sacred messengers, whose safety had to be respected. When the Shah of Khwarezm killed Mongol envoys, it sealed his fate. The Mongols saw this act not just as betrayal, but as a violation of the laws of the world itself. In response, their campaigns became not only conquest, but punishment. Across the empire, the message was clear. Harm the Khan's envoys, and you invite destruction. Diplomacy also extended beyond war. Genghis Khan built alliances when useful, sending envoys to distant kingdoms, proposing trade, and offering peace in exchange for recognition of his authority. Some accepted, seeking the safety of Mongol protection. Others refused, believing their walls or armies could withstand him. Time and again, those who refused learned the price of defiance. The use of terror and diplomacy also revealed the pragmatism of Mongol rule. Genghis Khan cared less about ideology than about loyalty. He did not seek to convert the world to his beliefs, nor to impose one culture on another. He sought order. If terror could bring it, terror was used. If diplomacy could bring it, diplomacy was offered. The balance between the two made his empire flexible, capable of adapting to each situation. For the conquered peoples, life under the Mongols could be harsh, but it was also surprisingly stable. Once submission was secured, taxes were collected, trade was encouraged, and daily life resumed. Farmers returned to their fields, merchants reopened their shops, and artisans worked under new rulers. Fear remained, but it was fear shaped into obedience rather than chaos. For the Mongol warriors, these tactics were a reflection of their leaders' wisdom. They saw that terror spread their fame, making future battles easier. They saw that diplomacy enriched them, bringing tribute without bloodshed. They understood that both methods strengthened their Khan's vision of an empire held together not only by force of arms, but by the perception of inevitability. The story of terror and diplomacy became part of Mongol legend. Around campfires, warriors spoke of cities destroyed, of envoys killed and avenged, of rulers who bowed before the Khan. The tales carried across deserts and mountains, told by merchants, travelers, and survivors. Each retelling magnified the reputation of the Mongols until it seemed they were unstoppable, a storm sweeping across the earth. In truth, they were not invincible. They suffered defeats, faced hardships, and relied on discipline as much as fear. But to the world that watched their rise, they appeared as an overwhelming force, unpredictable and relentless. And that perception, carefully shaped through terror and diplomacy, was itself a weapon one, as powerful as arrows or swords. The conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire was not only a victory for the Mongols, it was a turning point for the wider world. For centuries, the Middle East had been shaped by its own rulers, its dynasties, its trade, and its faith. The Mongols, coming from the distant steppe, seemed at first like an unfamiliar storm. But after the fall of Khwarezm, no one could ignore them. Their presence reshaped the balance of power in the Muslim world, and their reputation reached far into the lands of Europe. In the Middle East, the destruction of Khwarezm sent shockwaves through cities and kingdoms. Scholars and poets wrote of the fall of Bukhara and Samarkand with sorrow and horror. Stories spread of massacres, of walls broken, of survivors wandering in exile. For the Islamic world, these cities had been centers of culture and learning. Their loss was not only political, but also spiritual. To many, it seemed as if the Mongols had been unleashed as a punishment from God, a force beyond human control. The fall of Khwarezm also opened the door for further Mongol advances. Armies moved westward into Persia, into the Caucasus, and even beyond. The Mongols clashed with kingdoms that had never before faced riders from the steppe. Their speed, their discipline, and their terror carried them farther and farther. until even the lands of the Middle East felt the weight of the Khan's will. For merchants and travelers, the consequences were profound. The Silk Road, once controlled by local rulers and vulnerable to bandits, came under Mongol authority. Trade routes were secured, caravans protected, and commerce revived under new rules. While many feared the Mongols, others found opportunity in their empire. Goods could move more safely than before, and merchants carried silk, spices, and ideas across distances that had once seemed impossible. The arrival of the Mongols also reshaped diplomacy. Muslim rulers debated how to respond. Some resisted and suffered destruction. Others submitted, sending tribute and envoys, hoping to survive under Mongol rule. The choice was stark. Defiance could mean ruin, but surrender could bring protection. Each decision carried weight, and each shaped the future of the region. Meanwhile, in Europe, news of the Mongols spread with a mixture of fear and fascination. Travelers and envoys carried stories of an unstoppable army from the east, a force that had crushed kingdoms and shattered cities. To many Europeans, the Mongols were a mystery. Were they barbarians, savages without law? Or were they part of a divine plan, perhaps even a people foretold in prophecy? The uncertainty only deepened the sense of awe. When Mongol forces pushed into Eastern Europe in later campaigns, their reputation was already known. The destruction of Khwarezm had been a warning. Kings and princes prepared, but none could fully imagine the speed and ferocity of the riders. To the west, the Mongols seemed not like an army, but like a natural disaster, sudden, vast, and unstoppable. The consequences of the Khwarezmian conquest also reached into religion. Muslim scholars debated the meaning of the Mongol invasions. Some saw them as punishment for sin. Others believed they were a test, a trial to strengthen the faithful. In sermons and writings, the Mongols became more than enemies. They became symbols, reminders of the fragility of power and the unpredictability of history. For the Mongols themselves, the conquest of Khwarezm was a demonstration of their strength. They had defeated a great empire, one that had seemed powerful and secure. They had shown the world that no kingdom was beyond their reach. For the warriors who rode westward, it was proof of their destiny, a sign that the eternal blue sky had chosen their Khan to rule not only the steppe, but lands far beyond. The destruction, the fear, and the awe left by the Mongols did not fade quickly. For generations, the memory of their advance lingered in the Middle East and in Europe. Cities rebuilt, dynasties rose and fell, but the stories remained. Around fires, in markets, in mosques and churches, people spoke of the storm from the east, of the horsemen who came suddenly and left ruin behind. The conquest of Khwarezm was more than an episode of war. It was a moment when the Mongols entered fully into the stage of world history, no longer confined to the steppe or to Asia alone. Their empire now touched the heart of the Muslim world and cast its shadow over Europe. The consequences were fear, trade, diplomacy, and a new awareness that the balance of power had changed forever. After the fall of Khwarezm, the Mongols did not stop. Their armies, strengthened by victory and driven by discipline, looked farther west. Beyond the Caucasus and the steppes of the Black Sea lay lands unfamiliar to them, forests, rivers, and kingdoms of Europe. These were places that had never imagined facing riders from the far Mongolian steppe. Yet, in the 1220s and 1230s, the storm that had destroyed Khwarezm swept into Eastern Europe. The first encounters came through the Caucasus Mountains, where Mongol detachments clashed with Georgian and Armenian forces. Here they faced warriors who fought not on wide plains, but among rugged hills and stone fortresses. Yet the Mongols adapted. Their speed and cunning allowed them to bypass strongholds. striking where defenses were weakest. Even in these unfamiliar landscapes, their discipline gave them the advantage. Soon, the Mongols pushed northward into the lands of the Rus principalities. These were fragmented states, each ruled by its own prince, often more divided against one another than united. The cities of Kiev, Vladimir, and Novgorod were important centers of trade and culture, connected by rivers and forests rather than by open plains. To the Mongols, this division was an opportunity. A people divided could not resist with strength. In 1223, the Mongols clashed with a coalition of Rus princes and their Cuman allies at the Battle of the Kalka River. The Mongols, though outnumbered, used deception to draw their enemies into pursuit. Feigning retreat, they lured the coalition into disarray. Then, turning suddenly, they surrounded and crushed them. The victory was devastating. The princes were captured, many executed, and their armies scattered. The Rus had seen for the first time the power of the steppe horsemen, and the memory of Kalka lingered long after the battle ended. For a time, the Mongols withdrew, focusing on campaigns elsewhere. But the lands of Eastern Europe had been marked. In the late 1230s and early 1240s, under the leadership of Genghis Khan's descendants, the Mongols returned in force. Entire cities were besieged and destroyed. Ryazan was among the first to fall, its walls breached, its people slaughtered. Moscow, still a small settlement at the time, was burned. Kiev, the great city on the Dnieper, resisted bravely, but in 1240 it too was captured and devastated. The Mongols did not merely raid, they sought to bring the Rus lands under tribute. Those who resisted were crushed. Those who submitted were allowed to rule under Mongol oversight, paying taxes and acknowledging the authority of the Great Khan. This mixture of terror and pragmatism mirrored the strategies used in Asia, even in Europe. The Mongols balanced destruction with diplomacy. The campaigns extended beyond the Rus. In 1241, Mongol armies advanced into Poland and Hungary. At Legnica, they defeated a European coalition led by Duke Henry the Pious of Silesia. At Mohi, they crushed the Hungarian army, their horse archers outmaneuvering heavy cavalry and infantry alike. Europe, accustomed to wars among its own kingdoms, was stunned by the speed and precision of the Mongol advance. Yet the Mongols did not remain in Europe forever. In 1242, news reached them of the death of the great Kongadai, successor of Genghis. Following tradition, the princes returned east to take part in the selection of a new ruler. The withdrawal spared much of Europe from deeper conquest. But the memory of the invasion remained vivid. For the people of Eastern Europe, the Mongol campaigns were catastrophic. Cities burned, populations were scattered, and tribute was demanded. Yet, in the long term, Mongol rule also reshaped the region. The Rus principalities, once fragmented, came under the dominance of the so-called Golden Horde, the western part of the Mongol Empire. This rule lasted for generations, influencing politics, trade, and even culture. For the Mongols, these campaigns proved that their methods could succeed even in lands far different from the steppe. Forests, rivers, and castles posed challenges, but not barriers. Discipline, mobility, and strategy carried them forward. Their reputation spread deeper into Europe, where kings and popes debated how to face such an enemy. Some sent envoys, hoping to understand or negotiate. Others prepared defenses, fearing the riders might return at any moment. The Mongol presence in Eastern Europe was brief, but its impact was lasting. It revealed to the world that no land was too distant, no kingdom too strong, no wall too high. From the plains of Mongolia to the forests of Europe, the horsemen of Genghis Khan had shown their reach. The advance of the Mongol armies into Eastern Europe and the Middle East was more than a series of battles. It was a shock that rippled across continents. Kingdoms that had believed themselves safe behind walls and rivers discovered that the riders of the steppe could reach them. The Mongols did not arrive quietly. They arrived with speed, with fire, and with discipline. Their presence left marks not only on cities and lands, but also on the minds of rulers, priests, and ordinary people. In the Muslim world, the fall of the Khwarezmian Empire remained a wound that did not heal. Cities like Bukhara and Samarkand, once centers of learning and culture, lay in ruins. Scholars and poets lamented the destruction. Some described the Mongols as a scourge sent by God, a punishment for sins, a storm sweeping away arrogance. Others spoke of them as demons, not men, creatures who rode from the east with no respect for life or faith. Yet the impact was not only destruction. In the lands that surrendered, the Mongols brought stability. Trade routes, once dangerous and uncertain, became safer under their control. Caravans moved across Central Asia with greater security than before. Markets reopened, goods flowed, and wealth returned, even in the shadow of fear. For some merchants and artisans, Mongol rule brought opportunity. They could travel farther, trade more widely, and carry ideas across continents. For the Christian kingdoms of Europe, the Mongol advance into Poland and Hungary was a moment of deep alarm. At the Battle of Legnica, European knights charged with heavy armor, confident in their strength. They were met by waves of Mongol horse archers who struck from a distance, retreated, and struck again. The knights, unused to such tactics, were surrounded and defeated. At Mohi, the Hungarian army faced a similar fate. Bridges collapsed under the weight of soldiers, arrows rained from the sky, and the battlefield became chaos. The news of these defeats spread quickly. In the courts of Europe, kings and nobles whispered about the Mongols. Some believed they were the armies of the apocalypse, sent as a sign of the end of the world. Others wondered if they might be allies. Rumors circulated that the Mongols were connected to Prester John, a legendary Christian king believed to rule somewhere in the east. Perhaps some thought these riders were allies against the Muslims. But the destruction of Christian cities soon ended such hopes. The Catholic Church took notice. Letters were sent, councils held, and envoys dispatched to the Mongol court. Popes sought to understand these new powers, to discover whether they could be converted, or at least restrained. The answers were unsettling. The Mongols were open to discussion, respectful of religion, even tolerant of different beliefs. But they demanded submission, not partnership. They accepted envoys, but always carried the same message: recognize the authority of the great Khan, or face destruction. The impact of the Mongols on both Muslim and Christian worlds was therefore twofold. On one hand, they spread fear. No city, no matter how strong, seemed safe. No army, no matter how large, seemed secure. On the other hand, they created connections. The Silk Road, under Mongol control, became a bridge between worlds. Europeans learned of lands farther east, of goods, of ideas. The Muslim world saw its scholars, artisans, and traders drawn into the Mongol Empire, carrying knowledge and skills across continents. For the rulers of these lands, the Mongols were a dilemma. To resist meant risking destruction. To submit meant acknowledging a foreign Khan. Each choice carried consequences. Some chose defiance, and their cities were destroyed. Others chose submission, and their lands were spared, though they were bound by tribute. The impact of these decisions shaped the histories of both Christian and Muslim kingdoms for generations. For the ordinary people, the impact was more immediate. Villages burned, cities fell, families were displaced. Yet, in the years that followed, some discovered a strange stability under Mongol rule. Roads were safer, trade more reliable, justice more consistent. Fear remained, but it was balanced by order. The world was changing, and the Mongols were at the heart of that change. The campaigns in Eastern Europe and the Middle East did not end with final conquest. The Mongols withdrew after the death of Genghis Khan, returning to the east to choose a new ruler, but the memory of their presence remained. In both the Muslim and Christian worlds, the Mongols had shown their power. They had revealed that the steppe could reach across continents, and they had left behind not only ruins, but also stories of terror, of speed, of inevitability. Under the eternal blue sky, Genghis Khan's vision was unfolding. His empire was no longer confined to the lands he had known as a boy. It now touched worlds he had once only heard of in stories. The impact of his conquests was felt not only on the battlefield, but in the hearts of rulers and people alike. The world had changed, and it would never be the same again. When the Mongols rode into Europe, they brought not only armies, but also a reputation that grew larger than life. Their victories in the East had already inspired fear, but in Europe, fear became legend. To many, the Mongols were not simply men. They were a force of nature, a storm sweeping across the world, a punishment sent from heaven. The destruction of cities like Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev spread tales of horror across the Russlands. Survivors spoke of walls reduced to rubble, of populations massacred, of riders who seemed to appear out of nowhere and vanish just as quickly. For generations, mothers in Eastern Europe told their children stories of the Mongols, warnings wrapped in fear: be obedient, or the horsemen from the east will return. In Western Europe, where the Mongols had not yet reached, the fear was even stranger. Reports arrived through merchants, envoys, and fleeing refugees. At Legnica, knights had fallen despite their armor. At Mohi, the Hungarian army had been crushed. To kings and popes, it seemed as if no army could resist them. Some believed the Mongols were the armies of Gog and Magog, names from Christian prophecy unleashed at the end of time. Others thought they might be allies in disguise, perhaps even the soldiers of the legendary Prester John. Confusion and dread spread hand in hand. The speed of the Mongols was part of their terror. European armies moved slowly, bound by supply trains and heavy armor. The Mongols seemed to defy distance, covering vast lands in days, striking before news could travel, retreating before resistance could gather. Their movements were like the wind in scene until they arrived, unstoppable when they struck. Their discipline also inspired awe. European warriors were used to battles where chaos reigned and knights sought personal glory. The Mongols fought differently. They moved as one, obeyed orders without hesitation, and used deception as a weapon. Feigned retreats, sudden ambushes, and coordinated attacks confused their enemies. To those who faced them, it seemed as though they fought not as men, but as a single living force. Yet terror was not only about the battlefield. The Mongols used fear as a deliberate strategy. Cities that resisted were destroyed completely, their ruins left as warnings. Cities that surrendered were spared, their people allowed to live under tribute. This pattern spread quickly. Resistance meant death, submission meant survival. The choice was simple, and many chose to submit, but the memory of destruction lingered, fueling the Mongols' reputation as merciless conquerors. This reputation traveled far beyond Europe. In the Middle East, poets wrote of the Mongols as a scourge. In Asia, merchants spoke of their power and reach. Even in lands they had not touched, their name was known. The word Tota, often used for the Mongols, came to be linked with terror itself, as if it meant people not of this earth, but of the underworld. The Mongols themselves understood the value of this reputation. They allowed stories of cruelty to spread, for fear could win battles without bloodshed. If a city surrendered upon hearing of Mongol vengeance elsewhere, the army saved time, resources, and lives. In this way, terror became not only a consequence, but a tool. For Europe, the Mongols left more than ruins. They left uncertainty. Were they coming back? Would their armies sweep farther west, into the heart of France, into the cities of Italy? When the Mongols withdrew after the death of Genghis Khan, many in Europe believed it was only a pause. They feared the riders would return at any moment. The dread hung in the air for years, shaping diplomacy, military planning, and even religious thought. For the Mongols, the campaigns in Europe proved that their empire was truly global in scale. From the Pacific Ocean to the forests of Poland and Hungary, their name was spoken in fear and awe. Few in history had spread their influence so far, so quickly. And yet, beneath the stories of terror, another truth existed. The Mongols were not demons, nor a supernatural force. They were men disciplined, organized, and led by a Khan who understood the power of reputation. Their strength lay not only in arrows and horses, but in the fear they inspired, a fear that lingered long after their armies had passed. In Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, the name of the Mongols became more than history. It became legend. A reminder of a time when the horsemen from the steppe seemed unstoppable, when the world trembled at the sound of hooves, and when the sky itself seemed to carry their shadow. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire stretched farther than any Mongol could once have imagined. From the plains of Mongolia to the cities of northern China, from the deserts of Central Asia to the mountains of Persia, his power had no rival. Yet empires do not live forever, and leaders, no matter how great, must one day depart. For the Mongols, the death of Genghis Khan brought a new challenge: how to preserve what had been built, and how to carry forward the vision of the great Khan. The Mongols did not believe that death ended a ruler's influence. They believed that a Khan, chosen by the eternal blue sky, remained a presence even after his passing. Genghis Khan's body was carried back to Mongolia, buried in secret, the place unknown. His spirit, they believed, returned to the heavens, but his legacy remained on the earth. The empire was not only his creation, it was his gift to his family, to his sons, and to his people. The question of succession was not simple. Among the Mongols, leadership had often passed through family lines, but not always directly from father to son. It was the Kurultai, the great council of chiefs and princes, that decided who would be Khan. After Genghis Khan's death, his family gathered, along with the leading commanders of the empire. The council chose Gedai, his third son, to be the next great Khan. Gedai was not the eldest son. His older brother, Joki, had a claim, but doubts lingered about his legitimacy, for he had been born after Bert's capture by the Mongolians. To avoid division, Genghis Khan had chosen Gedai as his successor before his death. The council respected this decision, and so, in 1229, Gedai was formally proclaimed Great Khan, taking his father's place at the center of the empire. Gedai inherited not only vast lands, but also a vast responsibility. The empire was still young, still fragile. It stretched across mountains, deserts, and cities, filled with peoples of different languages, beliefs, and traditions. To hold them together required not only strength in battle, but also wisdom in rule. Gedai continued the work his father had begun, relying on the Yasa, on discipline, and on the loyalty of his generals. Under his rule, the Mongol expansion did not slow. Campaigns continued in China, where the Jin Dynasty was finally destroyed in 1234. In the west, the Mongols advanced into Russia, Poland, and Hungary, as far as the edges of Europe. These campaigns carried the empire to new heights, making it larger than any empire before it. But the succession also revealed the challenges of ruling such a vast domain. The empire was divided among Genghis Khan's sons and their descendants. Each received lands to govern, each ruled in the name of the great Khan, but each also held ambitions of his own. The unity that Genghis had forged was strong, but it was tested by rivalry, by ambition, by the pull of family and tradition. The role of the great Khan was to hold these forces together. Gedai sought to balance them, rewarding loyalty, punishing betrayal, and relying on the discipline of the Mongol system. Yet the task was immense. The larger the empire grew, the more difficult it became to maintain unity. Distance stretched communication, local rulers gained power, and rivalries deepened. Still, the early succession showed the strength of Genghis Khan's legacy. His choice of Gedai was respected. His laws, the Yasa, remained in force. His generals, loyal to his memory, continued to serve. The empire he had built did not collapse with his death. Instead, it grew larger, stronger, more feared. For the Mongol warriors, the death of Genghis Khan was a moment of sorrow, but also of continuity. Their loyalty shifted to his son, but their faith in the vision of the great Khan remained. They continued to ride, to fight, to conquer. The sound of hooves still echoed across the plains, the mountains, and the forests. For the world beyond, the death of Genghis Khan might have seemed an opportunity. Perhaps the storm from the east would finally pass. Perhaps the empire would collapse into division. But instead, the Mongols returned, their armies stronger, their reach farther. The legacy of Genghis Khan was not only preserved, it was expanded. The succession of Gedai showed the world that the Mongol Empire was not the creation of one man alone, destined to die with him. It was a system built on discipline, on law, on loyalty. It was an empire that could survive the death of its founder, because it was more than his will. It was the will of the eternal blue sky, carried forward by his family, by his warriors, and by the empire he had created. When Genghis Khan built his empire, he built it not only for himself, but for his family. The Mongols had always lived in a world where kinship and loyalty were inseparable. A man's sons, brothers, and nephews were not only family, but also commanders, allies, and heirs. The empire that stretched from China to Persia was therefore not ruled by one man alone, but by the house of Genghis Khwarezmian clan. After his death in 1227, the question of how to divide and govern such vast lands became one of the greatest challenges his heirs would face. The Mongols did not think of inheritance in the same way as kingdoms of Europe, where the eldest son often took everything. Among the steppe peoples, division was common. Each son received a share, not only of herds and wealth, but also of land and followers. Genghis Khan followed this tradition, though on a far grander scale. His empire was divided among his sons, each given a region to govern in the name of the great Khan. Joki, his eldest, had been granted lands in the west. Yet doubts about his parentage born after Bert's capture by the Merkits had created tension with his brothers. Joki died before his father, but his sons inherited his share. From their lineage came the rulers of the western steppes, later known as the Golden Horde, stretching across Russia and Eastern Europe. Chagatai, the second son, was given control of Central Asia. His Ulus, or domain, included the lands of the old Khwarezmian Empire. Filled with deserts, mountains, and ancient cities. Chagatai was known for his strictness in upholding the Yatsa, and his descendants ruled what became the Chagatai Khanate, a realm that stood as a bridge between East and West. Gedai, the third son, was chosen as Great Khan. His authority extended over the whole empire, but his personal lands lay in Mongolia itself, the heart of the empire. From there, he governed the vast domains of his brothers and nephews, relying on loyalty to maintain unity. Under Gedai, the empire continued to expand, conquering northern China and pushing into Eastern Europe. Tolui, the youngest, received the homeland of Mongolia, along with command of the imperial army. Though he did not become Great Khan, his role was vital. His descendants would later include some of the most famous rulers of the empire, including Kublai Khan, who founded the Yuan dynasty in China, and Hulagu, who led the conquest of Persia and founded the Ilkhanate. This division was both practical and dangerous. It allowed the sons of Genghis Khan to govern lands too vast for one man alone. Each ruled locally, collecting tribute, maintaining order, and expanding the empire. Yet each also held power of his own, power that could lead to rivalry. The unity of the empire depended on loyalty to the Great Khan, but ambition and distance often strained that loyalty. In the years after Genghis Khan's death, these divisions began to show. The Golden Horde in the west developed its own identity, ruling over the Rus principalities and interacting with Europe. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia became a center of trade and conflict, balancing between Persia and China. The Ilkhanate in Persia, founded later by Tolui's descendants, carved out its own policies, its own wars, its own culture. And in China, Kublai Khan created a dynasty that blended Mongol rule with Chinese tradition. Though divided, the empire still shared a common origin. The sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan remembered the Yasa, the laws of their father. They respected the Kurultai, the great council that elected the Great Khan, and they carried the memory of the eternal blue sky, under which their father had united the tribes. For a time, these shared traditions held them together, even as distance and ambition pulled them apart. For the world beyond, the division of the Mongol Empire did not weaken its power. Instead, it made it seem even greater. For Khanates, each vast, each powerful, each connected by trade and diplomacy, stretched across Eurasia. Together, they formed the largest continuous empire the world had ever seen. For the Mongol warriors, the division meant new horizons. Some rode west, with the Golden Horde crossing into Europe. Others remained in Central Asia, guarding trade routes and conquering cities. Still others marched east into China or south into Persia. Wherever they went, they carried the name of Genghis Khan, a name that bound them together even as their rulers diverged. The division of the empire among the heirs of Genghis Khan was therefore both a continuation and a transformation. It preserved his legacy by giving each son a share, but it also planted the seeds of future rivalry. In time, the unity of the empire would fade, replaced by separate khanates, each with its own destiny. Yet, in the 13th century, the world still saw them as a single force, a single storm, a single empire under the shadow of the Great Khan. The empire of Genghis Khan was the largest the world had ever seen. From the Pacific to the edges of Europe, from the frozen steppes of the north to the deserts of Persia, it stretched across continents. Yet size was both its strength and its weakness. The empire was vast enough to inspire awe, but so vast that unity was difficult to preserve. After the death of Genghis Khan, his heirs inherited not only lands, but also the challenge of keeping those lands together. At the heart of the problem were family rivalries. Genghis Khan had divided the empire among his sons, each ruling a share, while the title of Great Khan went to Gedai. This arrangement gave balance, but also created tension. Each son had authority in his own domain. Each wanted recognition. Each had followers who urged him toward independence. Unity depended on loyalty to the Great Khan, but ambition often threatened that loyalty. The first years after Genghis Khan's death were relatively stable. Gedai ruled as Great Khan, and his authority was respected. His brothers Chagatai and Tolui supported him, and the empire continued to expand. But beneath the surface, divisions were forming. Joki's descendants in the west, ruling the Golden Horde, felt distant from the center of power in Mongolia. Chagatai's realm in Central Asia developed its own traditions, sometimes clashing with its neighbors. Tolui's descendants in Persia and China sought their own glory. The Mongols had always valued the Kurultai, the great council of princes and chiefs. It was here that decisions about succession were made, where rival claims were debated. Yet even the Kurultai could not erase rivalry. When Gedai died in 1241, a struggle began. His son Giok became Great Khan, but his rule was short. After him, disputes grew sharper. Different branches of the family put forward different candidates. Alliances shifted, old rivalries deepened, and the unity of the empire became more fragile. Despite these rivalries, the Mongol Empire remained powerful. Its laws, the Yasa, continued to provide structure. Its communication system, with relay stations and messengers, kept distant lands connected. Its armies, disciplined and mobile, could still move swiftly across continents. Trade flourished along the Silk Road, linking China, Persia, and Europe in ways never seen before. The empire still functioned, but it was no longer a single, unshakable force. The rivalries were not only political, but also cultural. The descendants of Genghis Khan ruled over lands with very different traditions. In China, Kublai Khan adopted elements of Chinese governance, blending Mongol rule with Chinese culture. In Persia, Hulagu and his successors embraced aspects of Islamic administration. In Russia and Eastern Europe, the Golden Horde developed its own character, mixing Mongol and local customs. These differences enriched the empire, but they also pulled it in different directions. For the warriors of the steppe, these divisions were less visible. They still rode in the name of the Great Khan, still fought under the banners of the Borjigin clan. Yet even they must have sensed the changes. Orders no longer came from a single voice. Different princes commanded different campaigns. The unity of purpose that had once come from Genghis Khan himself now depended on fragile agreements among his heirs. For the world beyond, the Mongol Empire still appeared immense and unstoppable. Merchants marveled at the safety of the roads. Scholars wrote of knowledge flowing from one end of the empire to the other. Rulers feared the riders from the steppe, knowing that armies could still descend without warning. But inside the empire, the bonds of unity were loosening. The rivalries among the heirs of Genghis Khan did not immediately destroy the empire. For decades, it remained the largest force on earth. But the seeds of division had been planted. The Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Ilkhanate, and the Yuan dynasty in China would gradually drift apart. They shared a common origin, but each followed its own destiny. The unity of the Mongol Empire was therefore always fragile, held together by loyalty to a name, to a memory, to the vision of Genghis Khan. As long as his sons and grandsons remembered that vision, the empire endured. But as ambitions grew, and as distance stretched the bonds of kinship, the empire began to fragment. In the stillness of the steppe, under the eternal blue sky, Genghis Khan had once united the tribes. His heirs preserved that unity for a time, but they could not hold it forever. The Mongol Empire, like all great empires, carried within it both the strength of conquest and the fragility of division. Its rivalries shaped its destiny, turning a single vast empire into several powerful khanates, each carrying forward part of the legacy, but none able to preserve it whole. After the death of Genghis Khan, the empire he created did not fade. Instead, under his heirs, it reached its greatest extent. From the coasts of the Pacific Ocean to the plains of Hungary, from the forests of Siberia to the deserts of Persia, the Mongol Empire became the largest contiguous empire the world had ever known. This was its apogee, the height of its power, when the name of the great Khan was feared and respected across continents. The expansion continued under Genghis Khan, Genghis Khan's third son and chosen successor. He inherited not only the throne, but also his father's vision of conquest. Under Genghis' leadership, the Mongols completed the destruction of the Jin Dynasty in northern China. Their armies then turned west, sweeping across the steppes into Eastern Europe. It was during his reign that the Mongols defeated the armies of Poland and Hungary, reaching the very heart of Europe before withdrawing after Genghis' death. Genghis also focused on the structure of the empire. He established Karakorum as the capital, transforming it from a nomadic camp into a true city. From Karakorum, orders radiated across the empire, carried by the vast network of relay stations known as the Yam. With this system, messages could travel hundreds of miles in a matter of days, linking distant provinces with the center. After Genghis, the empire continued to expand under his descendants and under the leadership of Genghis Khan's other grandsons. Each branch of the family sought glory, and their ambitions carried Mongol banners farther than ever before. In Persia and the Middle East, Hulagu, a grandson of Genghis, led campaigns that shook the Islamic world. In 1258, he captured Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate. The city, once a center of learning and culture, fell to Mongol fire and sword. The Caliph was executed, and the old heart of the Islamic world was reduced to ruins. The shock of this conquest echoed across the Muslim world, altering its political and spiritual landscape. In China, another grandson, Kublai Khan, rose to power. Unlike many Mongol rulers, he chose to embrace aspects of Chinese governance. He moved the capital from Karakorum to Beijing, and in 1271 he declared the founding of the Yuan dynasty. Under his rule, China became a central part of the Mongol world, its wealth and population fueling the empire. Kublai's reign also connected the Mongols more directly to global trade, linking China with Persia, India, and even Europe. In Russia and Eastern Europe, the descendants of Jochi established the Golden Horde, ruling the vast steppes and the Rus principalities. They demanded tribute from Russian princes, shaping the politics of the region for centuries. Their influence extended across Eastern Europe, reminding kingdoms and cities that Mongol riders could still appear without warning. The empire at its apogee was not only vast in territory, but also rich in connections. The Silk Road flourished under Mongol rule. Merchants carried silk, spices, glass, and gold across Eurasia with greater safety than before. Travelers moved with fewer obstacles, their journeys protected by the authority of the Khan. Ideas, too, flowed more freely. Science, medicine, art, and technology passed between cultures that had once been separated by distance and danger. The Mongols themselves benefited from these exchanges. Though they remained riders of the steppe, they absorbed knowledge from the civilizations they ruled. Chinese engineers, Persian administrators, Arab scholars, and European artisans all found their way into the service of the empire. The Mongols were pragmatic, valuing skill over origin. In this way, the empire became not only a force of conquest, but also a bridge between worlds. Yet even at its height, the unity of the empire was fragile. The Khanate Golden Horde, Chagatai, Ilkhanate, and Yuan were growing more independent. Each followed the Yasa, the code of law, and each respected the memory of Genghis Khan. But each also developed its own traditions, its own ambitions, and its own path. The unity created by conquest was beginning to loosen under the weight of distance and diversity. Still, for much of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire stood at its peak. To the people of Europe, they were a distant but looming threat. To the Islamic world, they were conquerors who had destroyed Baghdad, but also patrons of trade. To China, they were rulers who blended steppe traditions with imperial governance. To the steppe itself, they remained the sons of the eternal blue sky. Carrying forward the vision of Genghis Khan, the apogee of the empire was a moment unlike any other in history. Never before had a single power controlled so much land, so many peoples, and so many routes of exchange. The horsemen of the steppe, once dismissed as barbarians, had created a world order that connected east and west, north and south, in ways that would echo for centuries. At its height, the Mongol Empire was not only the largest realm in history, it was also a bridge, an immense corridor through which goods, ideas, and people moved more freely than ever before. Conquest had brought fear, but it had also brought a strange kind of stability. The roads were safer, the markets more open, and the exchanges between distant cultures richer than at any other time. This period became known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, a time when innovations and cultural contacts spread across continents. The Mongols themselves were not inventors in the traditional sense. They did not create new machines or philosophies, but they were masters of adaptation. Wherever they conquered, they sought out artisans, engineers, and scholars, sparing them when others were slain and bringing them into Mongol service. Knowledge traveled with the empire, carried not only by merchants, but also by captives, by ants, and by craftsmen, resettled far from their homes. One of the most visible innovations was in communication. The Mongols expanded and perfected the relay system known as the Yam. Across the empire, stations with fresh horses were built at regular intervals. Couriers could travel hundreds of miles in a few days, carrying messages, reports, and orders. This system allowed the Khans to govern lands thousands of kilometers apart, and it also protected merchants, who could find shelter at these stations along their journeys. Trade itself flourished as never before. The Silk Road, once fragmented and dangerous, came under unified control. Caravans traveled from China to Persia, from India to the Mediterranean, carrying silk, spices, glassware, ceramics, and precious metals. In return, horses, wool, and furs moved eastward. Along with goods came knowledge, mathematics, and astronomy from the Islamic world, printing and gunpowder from China, medical texts from Persia, and even artistic styles that blended East and West. The empire also encouraged religious diversity. Monks, imams, priests, and shamans all lived under Mongol protection. Though the Mongols themselves remained tied to their ancestral beliefs, they tolerated other faiths and sometimes invited religious debates at their courts. This openness created a climate where ideas could move freely. Buddhism spread into new regions. Islam reached deeper into Central Asia, and Christianity found converts even within the Mongol aristocracy. Among the most striking exchanges was the movement of technology. Chinese inventions such as paper, printing, and gunpowder traveled westward more rapidly under Mongol rule. The knowledge of siege warfare, refined in the Middle East, was carried eastward. Medical practices, from herbal remedies to surgical techniques, were shared between cultures that had once been separated. Even cuisine changed, as ingredients and recipes crossed borders on the backs of caravans. The empire also reshaped art and architecture. In Persia, Mongol patrons commissioned grand buildings that blended steppe traditions with Islamic artistry. In China, Mongol rule introduced Central Asian influences into painting and design. In the courts of the Golden Horde, local styles merged with Mongol tastes, producing a unique blend of nomadic and settled culture. Wherever the Mongols ruled, the meeting of cultures left its mark. Perhaps the most famous traveler of this time was Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who journeyed to the court of Kublai Khan in China. His accounts, though colored by imagination, described a world connected by the Mongols' roads safe for travel, markets filled with wonders, and a court where East and West mingled. His stories carried the image of the Mongol Empire back to Europe, inspiring curiosity and fascination. For ordinary people, the Pax Mongolica meant different things. For some, it was a time of hardship, with heavy taxes and strict laws. For others, it was a time of opportunity, when merchants could prosper and ideas could spread without fear of bandits or warlords. For scholars and artisans, it was a time when knowledge moved farther and faster than ever before. The innovations and exchanges of this era did not belong solely to the Mongols, but the empire created the conditions for them to flourish. By uniting so much of the world under one rule, the Mongols reduced barriers, connected distant cultures, and allowed the seeds of invention and tradition to grow across continents. The Mongol Empire, born in fire and conquest, thus became a vessel of exchange. Its warriors had brought fear, but its peace brought connection. The innovations carried along its roads, the ideas exchanged in its markets, and the cultural blending it inspired would continue to shape the world long after the empire itself had fragmented. Every empire rises. Every empire, in time, begins to fade. The Mongol Empire, vast and unmatched at its height, was no exception. It had been built by the vision and discipline of Genghis Khan, expanded by his sons and grandsons, and sustained by fear, loyalty, and law. But the same forces that had made it strong also contained the seeds of its decline. Distance, diversity, and rivalry slowly pulled it apart. After the reign of Kublai Khan, who ruled China as the founder of the Yuan Dynasty, the unity of the empire began to fracture. The Golden Horde in the west, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Yuan Dynasty in the east all developed their own paths. They still called themselves Mongol, still traced their lineage to Genghis Khan, still claimed the blessing of the eternal blue sky, but they no longer obeyed a single ruler. The Kurultai, once the heart of unity, became a place of rivalry. Different branches of the family put forward different candidates for Great Khan, and the empire gradually split into separate khanates. The reasons for decline were many. Distance was one. The empire stretched across deserts, mountains, and seas. Messages, though carried quickly by the Yam, could still take weeks or months to arrive. Local rulers grew stronger in the absence of close oversight. Ambition grew where distance gave space. Diversity was another reason. The Mongols ruled over peoples of many languages, faiths, and traditions. At first, tolerance and pragmatism held them together. But, over time, the differences grew harder to manage. The Yuan dynasty in China became increasingly Chinese in its culture and governance. The Ilkhanate in Persia absorbed Islamic traditions. The Golden Horde blended with Turkic peoples on the steppe. What had once been one empire became many cultures, connected by memory but divided in practice. rivalry was the final force. The descendants of Genghis Khan, proud of their lineage, often competed with one another. Each sought greater power, greater wealth, greater recognition. Alliances shifted, wars broke out, and unity faded. The empire that had once moved as one now fractured into competing parts, and yet decline did not erase the legacy. The Mongol Empire may have fractured, but its impact remained. The Pax Mongolica had already changed the world. Trade routes across Eurasia had been secured. Knowledge had spread, and cultures had mixed in ways that would never be undone. The roads, built and protected by the Mongols, continued to serve merchants and travelers. The ideas carried across their empire influenced science, art, medicine, and philosophy. In China, the Yuan dynasty left its mark on architecture, culture, and government, even after it was replaced by the Ming. In Persia, the Ilkhanate blended Mongol and Islamic traditions, shaping the culture of the region for centuries. In Russia, the rule of the Golden Horde influenced politics, taxation, and military organization, leaving traces that would last long after the Mongols themselves were gone. The legacy of Genghis Khan was also carried in memory. To some, he remained a symbol of destruction, a conqueror whose armies left cities in ruins. To others, he was a lawgiver, a leader who valued loyalty and discipline, who created order where once there had been chaos. To his descendants, he was a source of legitimacy, a name that gave them authority, a reminder of the power they had inherited. For the Mongols themselves, the decline of the empire did not mean the end of their way of life. On the steppe, they remained riders, herders, and warriors. Their traditions endured, their identity preserved. They had built the largest empire the world had ever seen, and even as it fragmented, the memory of that empire remained. For the world beyond, the legacy of the Mongols was complex. They had brought destruction, but also connection. They had shattered kingdoms, but also created bridges between cultures. They had ruled with terror, but also with tolerance. Their empire did not last forever, but its impact stretched across centuries, shaping the world that followed. As the empire declined, the stories remained. Around campfires, in markets, in palaces and temples, people still spoke of the horsemen from the steppe. They spoke of the sound of hooves, the speed of arrows, the fall of cities, and the vastness of the empire. The Mongols had become more than conquerors. They had become legend. Under the eternal blue sky, Genghis Khan had united the tribes, built an empire, and reshaped the world. His heirs had expanded it, carried it farther than he himself had ever traveled. And though the empire eventually divided, though its power faded, its legacy endured. The Mongol Empire remains a reminder of the heights that human ambition can reach, and of the fragility that follows. It is a story of conquest and destruction, but also of connection and exchange. A story that shapes the paths of nations, the flow of trade, and the memory of peoples. And as the long night deepens, as the world grows quiet, the story of Genghis Khan's empire lingers, a vast empire born on the steppe, stretched across continents, and faded into history. But its shadow remains, cast across time, carried on the wind beneath the endless sky,